recording your audio on your end?
I just started recording it.
Great.
Yeah.
Great. Just because I figure we'll probably get better quality if we merge them together rather than relying on Skype.
Sure thing. Yeah.
All right. You ready to roll?
Ready to roll, man. Let's do it.
All right. I'm just going to get 10 seconds of room tone on my end. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to another episode of Mixed Mental Arts. This is Hunter Motz, and it is my distinct pleasure to have on the phone all the way from Australia, Dr. Mohammed. Do I want to go with the Khain on your last name?
No, Gilan is fine. Don't make it difficult for people.
Mohammed, welcome to the show.
Thanks, man. Thanks for having me.
What I think was really, firstly, Waleed Darab said that we had to have you on the show. Out of all the guests that he had on Greed for Ilm, and then the other thing was that you said, I just don't know that, it's like such an honor to be in such a esteemed company or something like that.
Well, you know something. I actually have. I'm a big podcast listener. If you look at my podcasts that I'm subscribed to, it's a bunch of them. But I, of course, don't listen to all of them. There are like a few handful that I make sure to consistently go back to and check out if there are any updates. And Mixed Mental Arts is one of them. So it's quite something to be on this.
Wow.
Yeah.
Wow. Well, that is exciting. Let's get a little bit of context on you. Let's take your cultural confession. Where did you grow up? What's been your experience? How did you come to be in sunny Australia?
All right. So I was born and somewhat raised between. I was born in Saudi Arabia in Riyadh, and raised mostly there. But my background is from Sudan as well. My mom's side is from Sudan. My dad was born in Sudan. He's originally from Yemen. So I spent quite a bit of time going back and forth between Saudi and Sudan until I was about 13 years old, when they decided, after the first Gulf War and all the events that took place over there, that education was my dad's focus for us, for his kids. So he looked into where he can put us, and Canada was the place to be. So he applied for immigration. Long and behold, we ended up going to Vancouver when I was 13 years old. And so I basically grew up during my high school years there. After high school, worked for a bit. I went to the University of Victoria on Vancouver Island. I studied, got myself a Bachelor of Science in microbiology, minored in business, and then I got into a graduate degree program for neuroscience, where I got my PhD in neuroscience there. And towards the end of my degree, I was really annoyed with the basic science and the lack of translation in my field, like the specific that I was dealing with. So I wanted to get into more translational medicine stuff. And after looking into it, unless you have some insane networking skills and people that it's kind of really difficult to get into the medical field without an MD with regards to research. So I decided to write the MCAT. I was like, I got to pursue this a bit more. So I wrote the MCAT just to see what would happen. There's also in the back of my mind, I didn't want to grow up to be 60, 70 years old if I'm granted to live that long, and look back at my life and think, what if I could have been or done this or done that? So I figured, why not just give it a shot and see what happens? So I applied all over the place and got into the University of Queensland. And so here I am. That's in a nutshell kind of my academic trajectory. I also spent quite a bit of time during all of these years connecting with different Muslim theologians and scholars, where I studied with them kind of outside of working hours and outside of school hours. So I would go sit with my teacher, and we'd study all of these different traditional texts and go through the tradition. And anytime I had an extended break, so during the summertime when I had 2 or 3 months off, I would actually travel. So I would go off to Egypt, Saudi Arabia, went to Turkey, went to Spain, also southern Spain for a period of time, and had more intensive study periods with teachers. And so I kind of tried to combine the world of theology and Islam and tradition with the world of my scientific pursuits. And out of all of that, I have this, everybody has their own thing that they want to answer, or there's a question that's burning in the back of their mind. And for me, it has to do with human nature, the soul, the spirit, the intellect. One of the things in the Islamic tradition, for somebody to be what is called legally responsible in the Islamic tradition, In other words, for you to be accountable to God, you have to have intellect. And usually you get taught that from a legal perspective. You have to have intellect. But what does that mean? They just say you have to be a sound mind. Well, what does that mean? And then if you look into my research in neuroscience was in autism spectrum disorders. And I asked myself the question, well, it's a spectrum. There's really no black or white to it. At what point is an autistic person no longer legally responsible in Islamic terms? What is the cutoff line? And then I started to ask the questions about the human psyche, and I'm really fascinated by the human mind and how it works. And so for that, I really believe that for you to gain an insight into it, it's not enough for you to just sit around and read a bunch of books about what neurologists saw and what psychiatrists think about it. You have to have this experiential engagement with it. So I kind of have to go and do this MD, and that's kind of what I'm pursuing right now.
Well, I now understand why Waleed thought that I would love you. There's just a lot there. I mean, firstly, we were both born in Riyadh.
Yeah. Wow.
That's something I don't often get to say. Secondly, there's a lot of fascinating stuff going on there in terms of like very different parts of the Islamic world. Yemen, Sudan, Saudi Arabia. There's a whole lot of cultural differences going on there. And then moving to Vancouver, and then sitting astride, these two cultures that we've sort of been, we've certain people whose names I won't mention have repeatedly told us are incompatible, Islam and then science. And then all of that travel. And, on top of that, if that wasn't enough to love you, you're getting into translational medicine, so you're really looking at the diffusion of innovations and diffuse and move between cultures. So, I mean, really, I owe Waleed some sort of, cupcake or just something nice. Because, what a present he's given me here.
Waleed is good people.
Yeah, he's a great guy. I mean, wow. I mean, he's like outdone himself here. So why don't we start with the translational medicine thing? Because it really is this problem of diffusion of innovations. And in particular, one of the things that, my dad and I talked a lot about is there was this UN Human Development Report, I think it was number 2 or something, about building a knowledge society in the Islamic world. And they just had some pretty staggering statistics on translation. And crucially, that I think since the year 1000, the same number of books being translated into Arabic as are translated into Spanish in 1 year, and that 5 times as many books are translated into Greek, which is a much, much smaller language than are translated into Arabic.
It's depressing.
Well, it is, but I think that's the thing is, again, like he who shall not be named would tell us that, that's because of he would sort of offer a very simplistic analogy about, or story about Islam and religion, but there are other problems like the fact that the Islamic world, I mean, firstly, saying that Arabic is one language is a pretty, it's the old joke about the difference between a language and a dialect as an army.
Yeah. Yeah, totally.
And I mean, the difference between Maghrebi Arabic, since we're not doing the Khaim, and Egyptian Arabic and Saudi Arabic is quite different.
Oh, Saudis cannot understand what Moroccans say. Even Egyptians, like if you speak to a Moroccan, unless you get your ear used to it, and have Moroccan friends who would be so generous to speak in their dialect in front of you, and you spend enough time with them, you still won't get it. Because there's just the way that they speak in the dialect, and then also the input of the French, because they were a French colony before. So it becomes very difficult to pick on what they're trying to say. And also they have a lot of references to very old kind of authentic Arabic language that you will only find in pre-Islamic poetry type of stuff. So some of their terminology is very, very authentic Arabic, and a lot of Arabs haven't heard it before. So it's difficult for you to speak to a Moroccan. Moroccans, when they go towards the east in the Arab world, they have to change how they speak so that they're understood. And Algerians are even worse. You can't even try with the Algerians.
Having dipped in, I know that in terms of language families, I know best. It's the Romance language families. And, the more time you spend with those, you realize that the differences between them at the fundamental underlying structure. So that's the Romance languages are French, Spanish, Italian, Portuguese. the underlying differences aren't that large. In fact, it seems to me like the underlying differences between the dialects of Arabic are actually much larger than a lot of the differences between the Romance languages. I can't quantify that, but I mean, it's a huge set of differences within the Arabic world.
I would agree with that, because I've seen people who speak French and don't speak Spanish. They can still pick up the Spanish. If somebody speaks Spanish, then they will understand the context of what's being spoken about, and vice versa. But if you go try to get a Saudi to speak with a Moroccan and have the Moroccan strictly adhere to their dialect, they'll pick out a few of the things. But if they really go hardcore into their Moroccan dialect, forget about it. It's not going to happen.
Yeah, so I think firstly those numbers, when you look at that UN Human Development Report, I mean, if you were to sort of narrowly say 250 million to 400 million Arabic speakers, that sort of misses a lot.
It should be mentioned though. It's so although there are all these different dialects in the Arab world, if you transcend it by using more of the official, what we would call the news type of Arabic, they will all get it. It's a common language that everybody understands, and that's why the news, like Al Jazeera, for example, will use this kind of formal form of Arabic that everybody will be able to understand it. So all the books are written in that. They're not written in dialects.
No, they're not written in Darija, but they're written in modern standard Arabic.
Yeah.
The level of mastery that, for example, if you pick out 7 million Libyans or whatever, how many of them are really comfortable reading modern standard Arabic?
You'd be surprised, actually. A lot of the literacy rate is quite high.
Okay.
And so you have to differentiate between, are you speaking about modern or are you speaking about older stuff? If I bring you an older traditional text from the Islamic tradition, a good portion of the Muslim world, the Arab world, will have problems understanding what the author is talking about and deciphering the meanings, because that was more of a kind of a formal type of Arabic that's closer to the Quranic Arabic. But if you look at modern standard Arabic, modern books, translations, things like that, they are quite accessible to most Arabs. They don't have problems understanding what's being said there.
So why do you think that there's this lack of translation of content into Arabic?
I'll give you kind of an indirect way to explain that, because I have somewhat of a relevant experience with this. My father is involved in building schools and the education sector in the Arab world. And for a period of time in the early 2000s, he was involved in building a university in Sudan. So he built this university where he had agreements with Canadian universities, and he wanted to grant internationally recognized degrees to Sudanese populace, and even international students from the rest of Arab countries to come into Sudan. They can get a degree that would be recognized internationally. Now, initially, the government was totally fine with that, and they were happy with him doing this, and they were all excited. They gave him a kind of free-for-all kind of 5 years, no taxation, so that you can build the school and have the funds for it, and they gave him all of these facilitations. They didn't think he would succeed. That's why they did all of that, and they were just excited to be associated with somebody like who's got Western education, who's gonna bring in Canadian university and a Canadian education system here. Once it got going and it started to generate quite a bit of funds and income from it, they basically came to him and they said, all right, so thank you so much for all of what you've done. We're now going to take this away from you, and we're going to give you 15% or 10%, whatever it was, as a management fee. But this is no longer your thing. You no longer own this. So my dad, being a hot-headed, hot-blooded Arab with a Yemeni background, he's like, forget about this. This is not going to happen. So they said, fine, we're going to put you in jail for a couple of days. And that's actually what they did with him. And he was put into a prison where the late Turabi, which is like amazing, it's a political prison. The jail guard was passing by, and my dad was telling us afterwards. He said he looked at him and was like, "Who are you?" Because you're not a politician, you're not a political figure, you're not an activist of any kind, and what are you doing here in a prison cell where we usually have reserved for previous presidents and prime ministers and ministers that we would jail if they stepped out of line? So, long story short, he eventually managed to get out with a loss. They paid him out. Somebody came through, and he just said, listen, I'll just buy it from you and you can just leave, and you no longer are welcome back here. And he only went back a couple of years back to visit finally. But he was basically banned, like, get out of here. So you have this, when you talk about education, and especially about a whole country, The reason a lot of this is not getting a lot of focus is because these governments are not interested in educating the public. The more education is power. If you all of a sudden awaken the beast, all of these masses that are not getting told what's what, and they're just concerned, their sole concern right now is food and shelter. Just keep them busy them enough with the concern of I need to eat and I need to make sure I have a roof over my head. Education becomes kind of an afterthought, and it's the thing for luxury and for the higher ups. And so to fund an effort to translate all of these works, that is not a private enterprise. That is not an individual effort. You need a government that is kind of progressive, that has a focus on education, that wants to uplift the people to go on and do this. You have to have institutions to do it, and that's not their concern. The last figure I remember seeing from Umar al-Bashir was he usurped something like $9 billion and has it saved up in Swiss bank accounts for his own self. And I'm just thinking, like, you're over 60 years old. What are you going to do with $9 billion? Like, what do you need this for? And why don't you want to disseminate it? The second you educate a people, they're going to start coming up and asking for their rights. And this has nothing to do with religion. This has nothing to do with their beliefs. It's just a matter of knowing things, and you don't want them to know things. So a lot of the works that they talk, right now when I travel to the Arab world and speak with people, it's really disheartening to see some of the discussions and how they unfold. They use old data. Some of the information that they have, scientific or technological, or they might use modern technology. But a lot of the theories that we speak about, contemporary theories in science, for example, today, they don't have access to the latest and the greatest of it. They have old information, and they argue using old information because they haven't had the work translated, because the government doesn't see it fit for things to get translated.
Well, and crucially, I mean, it's interesting because you're sort of like riding a line between that to some degree it's a sort of obliviousness and a lack of attention from the government, and to some degree it's also that it would not be in their interest to have an educated populace.
Not at all. Not at all.
Yeah. So, and I mean, there's also, James Tooley writes about this in A Beautiful Tree, and then, it's certainly true in Gaddafi's Libya that teaching jobs also become a form of political patronage, where an easy way to buy people off is to give them a teacher's salary, and they're then not expected to teach. But the point is, you're not getting people who actually really want to teach and really want to uplift. What they want is an easy salary.
It's teaching, it's control of the curriculum itself, so you can control the people and control the content. So I remember, for example, one of the most it's a hadith, it's a tradition, a statement from the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, where he said, the greatest, the master of martyrs on the Day of Judgment is a man or a woman who stands up, speaks truth against a tyrannical ruler, and commands them to do good, forbids them from doing the evil that they're doing, and then they get killed for it. This hadith is one of the most authentic hadiths in the Islamic tradition, yet most Muslims haven't heard of it. And it's in the interest of the government not to let this type of information disseminate across the masses. And so you have teachers that are being not properly trained, and top it off with not giving them the full content or the proper content to teach. And so now all of a sudden you have a populace that is being molded in the way that you want it to be, so that they can just kind of praise you as the holy king and the ruler and the savior and all of these things.
Well, and wow. So much of this is, obviously this is what's going on in the United States. Obviously there is not in the sense that, I think that a government is deliberately trying to keep the people from being educated or being exposed to ideas, although some people would say that. I think that fundamentally it just comes down to the system is broken. It's not working. And it's not likely to internally reform itself on any timeline that any of us can afford. And, there's this catch-22, which is that if you wanted to reform the system, the people need to be educated and informed enough to even know what kind of system they would want. Yeah. And crucially, what kind of education system actually serves people in the 21st century. And so either way, the next step is to use the internet to educate people and to start to move ideas and diffuse innovations.
Definitely. So here's the difference I should mention between the East and West, because you spoke about a system. which is a good thing to contrast between, say, a place like the Arab world, like Saudi Arabia, because my dad tried to build schools over there as well, where he built these international schools to bring in a Canadian curriculum and hybridize it with the Arabic and the Islamic studies and come up. My dad's PhD is in education curriculum development. So he wanted to create this hybrid program so that you can maintain your cultural and Islamic identity and at the same time modernize your so-called material sciences. So he brings this in. Now, the way that the system works in Saudi Arabia and in the Arab world generally, it's not based on systems and institutions. It's based on people. So you have the Minister of Education, for example. For you to get a curriculum approved, that one guy has to approve it. And that one guy has a couple of people, a couple of guys with him that, depending on whatever ideology they follow, they would review it. And if they see things that they believe that for whatever reason they have, that they think are problematic, that curriculum is not going to get approved and you're not going to get a license to open that school. So you have to adjust things according to the whims of that one guy and his little crew. Now, imagine the king dies, because it's not based on systems and institutions. It's based on people. The king dies, the next king comes in, he brings in his posse. So he changes the Minister of Education. So now you got a new guy that you have to go back to. Even though you have a full functioning school, you have to still got to go back to that guy and get him to approve your thing. And your school is in a perilous position now, because you could actually, and this has happened, your school could shut down because he doesn't approve of your curriculum anymore, because he believes you're spreading false ideas that will misguide the people or whatever the case may be. So it's not in line with their interests. So the systems in the Arab world, this talk about religion is really annoying because it comes from a place of total ignorance. If you understand how the government functions and how it's all rooted in the individual as opposed to institutions and systems, you'll start to see why it's all messed up the way that it is right now. I'm in Australia right now. People tell me that their government, they have a breakdown every couple of years. They don't have a sustained government that stays for a long enough period of time. The prime minister gets taken off, snap elections get called, but the country doesn't go into shambles. Same thing like Elizabeth May right now in England after Brexit and all that. She calls a snap election. The country is not going to go in shambles because it operates based on institutions, not on individuals. The Arab world, on the other hand, it's individuals. You get rid of one guy, the whole thing has to get overhauled, and you can never have a sustained thing going on. And education requires sustainability. It's a long-term view. You need somebody that has patience, that's not going to change in a couple of years because his whim changed or somebody came and just said something to him that bothered him. So, yeah. That's the problem with Trump right now. That's the dangerous thing that I see with America, by the way. Trump is changing the whole thing. He's dismantling institutions, and he's turning it into, it's based on individuals now. So I'm just going to put in this guy and that guy and that guy and this lady as a token because I need to put in a woman. And so he does this, and he makes it all about individuals. Eventually, the whole country would collapse, and that's the danger that America is going into right now.
Well, and it's a repeated danger of human societies,
Yeah.
because what we're talking about here, and this is to go back to your earlier point about why it's so important to understand how people work, this is a problem of human psychology, right? That
Yes.
Dr. Kelvin studies that Lord Acton talked about a long time ago, which is absolute power corrupts absolutely. And the reason why these systems and these checks and balances exist, because at the end of the day, it kind of doesn't really matter who is in power. Like
Yes.
any human sitting around unchecked for long enough goes nuts, and living in LA and watching what happens to celebrities. It's a really, LA is a great incubator to see what unchecked power does to human beings.
Yeah.
And it's a repeated, predictable cycle. And at a certain point, there's no mystery to it. So you understand why, America's founding fathers really put in these systems of checks and balances, and why Lord Acton says that, because at a certain point, it becomes pretty obvious what's going to happen.
Mm-hmm.
And I always think it's interesting. There's, we had Tamim Ansari on, who, wrote a couple of books, Destiny Disrupted, a view of history through Islamic eyes. And then he also wrote Without Rules, which is about Afghanistan. And he had this great line where he said, in the West, you think of it as corruption. In Afghanistan, we think, what kind of asshole would get into power and not help his family? And that's really the core problem. The word that I've heard used in Arabic is wasta.
Wasta, yeah.
The system of connections, the Chinese have a similar concept with guanxi. And, you find these concepts exist again and again in terms of connections and personal connections. And that's a lot of human history has been like that.
Mm-hmm.
And on an individual level, none of the actions seem so bad. Because it's like, I got this job, I have this government posting, there are these different guys who are coming to me with contracts, and, I'm not necessarily clear on what educational system is the best, but this guy is friends with my cousin, so, I'm going to help my cousin's friend out.
Yeah.
And on an individual level, that's, pretty understandable. It doesn't seem so terrible. But when everybody is playing the game that way, then the result is that connections become more important than it's no longer a meritocracy.
Mm-hmm.
And this problem of not having meritocracy is something that so many societies have struggled with. It's why the Chinese instituted the imperial examination system. It's why the Ottomans had the Janissaries.
Mm-hmm.
And why the United States went through this very painful process of getting rid of its own patronage system and putting in the Pendleton Civil Service Act and starting to have, the civil service be meritocratic. And I think it was Garfield was assassinated.
Mm.
Somebody who was an office seeker and wanted a patronage job and was like, what do you mean meritocracy? I want to be a postmaster because I'm buddies with someone. Charles Guiteau. So these are real recurring problems, and the challenge is to use "he who shall not be named's" favorite phrase. These are things we have to speak honestly about.
Yeah. Well, you know what? It's the modern kind of condition is to always. It's not the modern condition. It's human condition generally. Whenever something negative is happening, we like to reflect externally, like outwardly, like look at all of the different things outside that we can blame for our conditions. And whenever something good happens, we always attribute it to ourselves. I got successful because I'm so smart, I'm so clever, I've done this, I've done that, and we neglect to mention all of the different external factors that conspire to come together to put you in the position that you're in. And so yeah, you have to reflect on all of these downfalls of just human nature. These things that can put us, no matter how great of a person you are. I mean, that book, I still haven't managed to pick it up, The Power Paradox. Can't remember the author's name, but when he talks about the reason people get into power is because they were wonderful individuals to begin with. They get into power and then they get corrupted. And then they start to lose their own way. And there's actually a timeline you can observe this happening in. And so you have to remove that person off, and it's because it's something innate. It's not necessarily an external thing. And so you have to construct external things to basically counteract these internal tendencies. The problem is you start to forget about human nature, forget about what makes us the way that we are, and you start to blame everything outside of us and pretend that, all right, let's just remove religion from the equation and then we'll have a utopia. It'll be great because everybody is fundamentally fantastic and we're all utilitarian by nature, and that's it. It's kind of silly.
And also, crucially, I think, if you are a guy who is sitting in Brentwood, for example,
the hard streets of Brentwood,
that is, particularly wealthy and affluent and, pretty far removed from the experience of what a developing world society looks like, then, what's the most visible or superficial part of this culture that you see halfway around the world?
Mm-hmm.
And you fixate on these superficial differences, and you don't have enough on-the-ground experience to sort of see the patterns of behavior and to understand that, there are these sort of patterns of behavior of how you get things done, and that systemically that adds up to these huge problems.
Mm-hmm.
And, you don't understand also that, people are engaging. Like, one of the things that I find fascinating is that, you'll have people who are fundamentalists, but then you'll often have very powerful people who rationalize or justify away their behavior for them. And, you use their power to turn on those who are trying to call those fundamentalists out. And it's all sort of, the good Muslim boy. Oh, he's a good Muslim boy. And it's like, is he really? Like, what's his behavior? Is he really living those principles or not?
Yes.
And that's a lot of what this comes down to. And, the reason why figures like Muhammad, not this Muhammad, but presumably, I'm talking about the more famous one.
Yeah.
Jesus Christ and, the founders who came up with the scientific principle, it's these principles, right? And there are these clear, it's if you do this, you're doing the right thing. If you're changing your mind in light of evidence, that's great. Then you're on board with science. And if you're not changing your mind in line with evidence, then you're not a scientist. And it's those clear tests that get us over our cognitive biases towards apologizing away the behavior of the people we like or that we tribal affinity with, and start to universalize behavior in a way that gets us past our Dunbar number.
Yeah.
And so I think, that's sort of the real challenge of human history is this Dunbar number where, we've had to build larger and larger and larger societies. And at each stage, we have to stop looking past superficial differences and looking at those sort of core behaviors.
But that's cognitively demanding, Hunter. That's so hard.
And that's why we keep on falling short on it. But I think it's interesting the degree to which we don't actually have that as an option anymore. Because if we don't do it, then society is going to tear. The global society which exists, whether people like it or not, is going to tear itself apart. And so the work is to figure out how do we create more and more robust systems that check power, and that work within human psychology as it actually is. And Francis Fukuyama, obviously, it's one of the many people that I'm obsessed with. But he defines this so well, where he says, the challenge is how do we get to Denmark? How do you get to a society who's boring, stable, functional, takes care of its citizens?
Yeah.
And this is Fukuyama, who spent a long time studying this problem. He's like, we don't totally know. And if Fukuyama doesn't totally know, I don't think anybody knows.
Yeah, it's I wonder if because we speak about the Dunbar number, like it's I wonder if the population, the number of people, the population level, there is kind of a threshold beyond which what you see in Denmark is not feasible because the number of people has grown too much, and now you have to think of something different to meet the demands of a bigger population, and we're talking about a globalized world now. So I don't know. It's a difficult thing.
Well, I think what's interesting is that ironically, or not so surprisingly, some of the people who do this best are really the military and then religions, because they have these nested structures where you will have, like I was talking to this. There's a large number of U.S. Marines who are in the mixed martial arts community, and then there are a fair number of religious people, which I find both are fascinating. But it's because they understand that, the U.S. Marines will have fire teams of 4 to 5 individuals. They rotate everybody through the roles in the unit. That then adds up to, platoons and companies and on and on and on up to battalions. But there's this series of nested structures. Mega churches work in very much the same way. And that's the challenge, is how do you have structures that you can find a similar thing in Eric Glue and Nick Hanauer are talking about something very similar in Gardens of Democracy. And I think that's the challenge, is that part of, you don't have those nested structures of those communities that are tight and then feed up to, the, municipal level, the state level, the federal level.
That's interesting.
And part of what's broken down is people just don't even pay attention anymore at the state and local level. And so then we're trying to solve a lot of things in the United States at the federal level that really should be solved at the state and local level.
That's fascinating.
Yeah. So I think that's the opportunity, and the challenge is, Isaiah Gooley, who's one of the people in the community, used this Chinese Chengyu, the emperor, heaven is high and the emperor is far away. And I think there's become such a focus on our leadership and so little focus on what we can do locally. So even if you think about something like the translational medicine thing, there's a lot of educated Arabs, especially in the expat community. And if there's something they want to practically do to sort of help people back home, they can literally just be translating a lot of these books into Arabic, or a lot of these articles into Arabic. And even if they're not necessarily going to be accredited or recognized, even having them on the internet, people will gravitate towards that sort of wiki style.
I mean, it's the problem with this is we like we've built a culture, and this is one of the values that we've now adopted due to this mass celebrity culture. Before Facebook and social media, for you to become a known person, you had to actually do something. And so for you to get that recognition, it had to have an impact upon a large enough number of people, a great enough number of people for you to get this recognition. Now you could just do anything silly or whatever, and you can become a superstar, an internet superstar. And we've reinforced this time and time again, where it's almost like, I wonder if it's just like a dopamine circuit in the brain now for becoming recognized. That now we've reinforced this idea that anything I do must get recognition, and if it doesn't get recognition, I get too depressed to the point where the fear of not getting recognition for it, or the more the likelihood it is that I won't get recognized for it, the less likely I will get engaged in it. So a lot of meaningful work is being ignored for the sake of accolades, big hoopla. Let's just make a big splash on the internet. And even if it doesn't have any actual tangible benefit, it doesn't matter. I've made a name for myself. So to do this type of meaningful work, I could tell you, I translated a talk by, oh God, I can't remember the guy's name anymore. He wrote Phantom Limb. He's a neurologist in San Francisco, I think. And he did a TED Talk on some interesting brain kind of conditions that he defined from, or he observed in the clinic. And I translated the talk on TED to Arabic. That took a long time. Now, I don't get to share that with a lot of people. Very few people will recognize it. Very few people will give me this explicit, "Oh, thank you so much for doing this." They'll just watch it. If they don't speak Arabic, now they can speak. If they don't speak English, now they can watch it in Arabic, and it's great, and that's it. But it's not something that I get this constant payback for, so that it makes me feel good enough for me to engage in doing more of it. I wish I could do more of it. I'm just too busy with other stuff now. But it's not a popular thing. So I don't know. We're hard. It seems that we have wired ourselves, if we're not hardwired, into seeking accolades and recognition for every little thing that we do, even if it's mundane. Like, oh my God, you're so great. You got pregnant. Like what we do with celebrities. Like celebrities get pregnant now, and it's like, oh my God, it's the most amazing thing. You know what? It is an amazing thing, and it's a miraculous thing, but it's kind of often happens to a lot of women. Why don't they get recognition for it? It's not that special if you think about it. So I don't know.
And also, what are you then going to do with that kid? Like, let's celebrate. I mean, getting pregnant is, it's a great thing. But then, okay, let's see, how are you going to raise that kid?
Yeah.
Like, what's your commitment over the next 20 years?
Exactly.
Are you really making time for that kid? Are you really trying to figure out how best to parent, how best to educate, how best to prepare your kid for an environment that is fundamentally unpredictable?
Yeah.
But, I think the interesting thing here is that as you're saying all of this, there for you is a certain disgust or contempt or dissatisfaction with that system, that it just sort of feels very empty, that sort of superficial celebrity. I feel the same way. I felt this way for a while. And very much Mixed Mental Arts is a community of people, I think, who also would feel the same way and are very much sort of done with that culture and think it's dumb. And would much rather focus our time and energy and attention on actually figuring out problems.
Yeah.
So I think it's important to recognize that, so much of, we went a little nuts with the whole social media thing and just consumed a lot of cat videos and a lot of greasy butts and, and then a lot of figures like Milo Yiannopoulos who, and he who shall not be named, who say, very simplistic, inflammatory things. I mean, ISIS and Al-Qaeda, it's all the same thing. Social justice warriors. Yeah. I mean, it's all stuff that fits well in 140 characters. The work of someone like John Haidt or Joe Henrich, or, Dacher Keltner, who wrote The Power Paradox, or lots and lots and lots of people, they're not 140 character friendly.
No, they're not. It's very complex ideas, and it requires engagement on your part and patience. For you to, I mean, a lot of people don't like to. If I don't understand it now, then it's impossible to understand, or it's nonsensical. We always attribute it to the outside, rather than, you know what? Maybe I need to take some time to let this sink in, think about it for a while. I don't have to answer right away. And let me toy with these ideas. And if you look at older books, I'm a big fan of just reading older literature, older books rather than new ones, because the new ones have catered to this 140 character kind of attention span. So you have to have shorter chapters, you have to have ideas put into short sentences rather than taking one idea. If you look at books written in the late 19th century, one argument that could take 300 pages about one idea. And so you have to keep in mind all of the different lines of evidence. I mean, if you look at, for example, the most famous book right now that you can think of is, from a scientific perspective, is The Origin of Species. It's one idea, and he spends like 500 pages, Darwin, bringing in all of these different lines, and you have to keep them in mind. That's the hard thing about that book for a modern person to read it. And if it's kind of as an aside, ask most people who are proponents or anti-evolutionary theory fundamentalists. Most of them haven't actually read the book, at least from my personal experience. It's like, have you actually read?
I will tell you, having had the pleasure of encountering many of these people on Twitter in the last couple of months.
Yeah.
There's not a lot of it is, it's the same behavior you see all over the world and throughout human history.
Yeah.
That I'm using this to cudgel and belittle you, and have not read it myself, or I'm not particularly interested in sort of struggling with these ideas myself. The important thing is that it's tribal. It's about me defending my tribe and denigrating some other tribe.
Which is an emotional state to be in if you think about it. There's in the Quran there is a lot of rebuke towards sectarianism. And the phrase that is used, كُلُّ حِزْبٍ بِمَا لَدَيْهِمْ فَرِحُونَ, like every sect is joyous. They're in this emotional state of euphoria over what they have. And then later on in the Quran it says, I'll give you one piece of advice, one word of counsel. Get up and just be in singles or in twos. So just as individuals by yourselves or as just two people. Think about what you're talking about. Reflect on it deeply and have an actual constructive, rational discussion. But if you go in these sectarianism and all of these groups that I'm just going to use this because famous so-and-so who's put up on this pedestal says that it's true, therefore it must be true. And so I'm going to use it to mock you and to denigrate you. It doesn't make sense.
Well, and that's that righteous mind that John Haidt is talking about.
Yeah.
It's this feeling of like, oh, we're the good guys, other people are idiots, and that it rests heavily on these intuitions of authority of like there is some figure who has it all figured out, and anyone who doesn't adhere to this figure clearly doesn't understand anything and is an idiot. And the majority of people in those groups, in those cults of personality, they're not thinking for themselves, they're not reflecting, they're not actually trying to understand the ideas, and the result is that they're not challenging those people. They're not challenging those leaders and those figures, and so what ends up happening is they end up not being held accountable and just wander off the reservation. And are surrounded by a group of individuals who fundamentally justify their leaders' terrible behavior because there's an unholy pact there where, I don't want my leader to be shown up because I've now built up so much of my own identity around that leader.
That's exactly it. It's building the identity around that. And if you look at, who has the highest social currency in the public arena? It's the people that we give the social currency to. We say these are the intelligent few, these are the intellectuals, these are the ones that are who's smart and they figured everything out, and so we want to associate ourselves with them. The thing is, what got them into that position in the first place? What makes that person a public intellectual, and what makes them an intellectual as per the definition of what an intellectual is? And if you push further and look into what they've written, how they got that position, the history of their development, and then you start to come across some really interesting and intriguing things, and it would actually shake your faith in what they're saying. Now, if you've built your worldview in accordance with what that individual has said and argued for, and it just happened to titillate your own whims and your own biases, and so you've constructed this identity further with it and bolstered it, that's going to be a scary thing for you to investigate, because now you're going to have to dissociate yourself from that person, and along with that dissociation, you're going to have a bit of an identity breakdown, and people don't want to go through that. It's too hard.
It's a terrible emotional experience. I've had it. I wouldn't endorse it.
No, it's oh my God, it's such a difficult emotional experience because you have these people that you trust, that you look up to, that you've built. That's why in the Islamic tradition, we have one of the companions of the Prophet. He said, "Do not adhere your identity. Don't follow somebody who's alive. Don't base your identity based on that person. Look at the people of the past who have passed away long ago, and they've now become a solidified kind of an individual who's not going to change anymore because they died. Look at their work and look at their output as it is, objectively now as a whole thing. Like when Aristotle talks about what is happiness, it's not an outcome, it's a way of living. If you want to know if you lived a good life, it's not something it's an outcome that you seek, it's in the process of it. So you look at the overall outcome after they passed away. Is this a person who's worthy of actually taking up their ideas after they've developed them and put them together, and now this is the product that they give you? But if you go with somebody who's alive right now and you construct your identity around them, man, it's two things that could be scary for you. It's either you examining your own beliefs and examining what they say, or if they decide that they want to change. Now, all of a sudden, what are you going to do? Are you going to change along with them? I mean, I wonder about all of these guys with let's say the new atheists. What would happen? I think about this and I chuckle. What would happen if tomorrow, all of a sudden, Richard Dawkins comes out and says, "Ladies and gentlemen, I've been wrong all of my life. I now actually believe in this particular religion." And let's just say, just for argument's sake, because he always attacks it, Islam. And then he declares his testimony that I believe and testify that there's only one God and that Muhammad is his prophet, puts on a kufi, starts to wear the white robe, and goes to the mosque and starts to pray. What's going to happen to his community? Like all of these people that just follow him, the rest of the new atheists, what if they all just decide that, guys, we've been wrong all this time and now we're going to be Muslim? And we encourage you. And they start to actually go along the path of not just private Islam, but like publicly calling people to become Muslim. What's going to happen? There's going to be a huge breakdown and people are going to be freaking out.
Well, there'll probably be a sectarian split, right? I would think that, there's a group of people who will follow Dawkins, and then there are a group of people who will say, this is why Islam is so dangerous. Look, even the great Richard Dawkins was led astray by it.
Yes, that's exactly what's going to happen.
I think that's but the interesting thing is that, funnily enough, I think that if Dawkins actually went down that road, that in some senses he would also become more of a scientist, because what you're talking about in terms of, it's the difference between the idea of a destination and sort of knowing it all and being in the search and being in the hunt.
Yes.
This is that phrase that I stole, it takes 5 seconds to become a fundamentalist and a lifetime to become a Muslim.
Yeah.
And this also fits very much with, Atul Gawande's great speech, The Mistrust of Science, where he talks about, the scientific mind is an experimental one, not a litigious one.
Exactly.
And if you're really experimenting and you're really trying to figure things out, and I think that would be fascinating because, if Dawkins really had to get into Islam and really sort of explore these ideas and sort of understood the emotional power of the ideas and understood that a lot of the wisdom, right, although it may be in a different language and it may be expressed in different terms, actually is being validated and confirmed by science, right? And that was a very uncomfortable experience for me around John Haidt's happiness hypothesis, realizing the degree to which science had rediscovered much of what was already known. And now you have a real problem, and now you have to really try and make sense of, I fell prey to certain myths about science that essentially everything before science was a waste of time, and then suddenly we got serious about the search for wisdom and understanding.
Well, here's the thing about science, because we talked earlier about, just in chat, about like what is science, because we speak about it like it's this thing that everybody knows what it is. But it's hardly ever kind of defined as what is science when we speak about it. Like, what do you think science is?
Well, for me, I think it's a remarkably simple thing. I think it's that it's a response to the problem of the human mind.
Okay.
Which is that if you look at cultures across the world, they have believed a lot of things.
Yeah.
And that because of that naive realism, because culture binds and blinds, our beliefs always make sense to us. So I could believe any crazy counterfactual thing, and it makes perfect sense. So that your current beliefs make perfect sense to you tells you nothing.
Yes.
Because that just puts you together with everybody else who's having the human experience. And then I think that, in practice, it's then, testing your beliefs against whatever the observable evidence is.
Mm-hmm.
But the big problem is that what the observable evidence is depends on what your tools of observation are.
Yes.
So you don't have, a sort of an electron microscope in the 1400s, or you don't have the ability to do microbiology in 2000 BC. And so there's a limit to how good your beliefs can get. What's really upsetting, I think, for the new atheists in terms of cultural evolution is realizing that there are patterns that had been observed already. Joe Henrich, for example, gives this example of Fijian fish taboos, where there are all these fish that women can't eat when they're pregnant in Fiji.
Yeah.
And it's, turns out all of those are the fish that are likely to give ciguatera poisoning, and ciguatera poisoning is a big problem among pregnant women. So clearly they discerned some pattern there, because the human mind does pattern recognition. They just didn't understand causally why that was. But they didn't understand causally why that was because they didn't have the tools to do that kind of causal work. They didn't have a society that had a large enough hive mind to, generate the kind of wealth and prosperity that essentially you can have a scientific priestly caste that's just around and just studying these problems all day. So I think, the narratives, there's the myths that science has, evolved about itself and told about itself that are problematized by having better data. And Adam Grant said this great thing in our interview with him, where he said, science has never claimed to be perfect. It has only claimed to be the only self-correcting belief system. And I think that science is now, especially with all this cultural evolution stuff, really in this process of the self-correcting process where it's coming to realize that it reinvents the wheel and coming to see that cultural evolution has always been happening.
Yeah.
And that it's, accelerated in the last few hundred years. But that's also, that's partly because of the Columbian Exchange and that northern, Europeans suddenly didn't have the repeated cycle of famine because of potatoes and tomatoes. It's also because, you start to, because of that, have industrialization and start to have the kind of tools that enable the sort of observations that we associate with science in terms of microbiology and astronomy and on and on. But at its core, science is a very simple principle. It's, that you want to bring your beliefs into conflict with the evidence so you can shatter those beliefs to make space for a better belief. And that's very much what Spiros talks about, is that you want your belief to die because you know that the belief that emerges from the wreckage of that dead belief will be a better one than what you had.
So so I'll give you kind of my take on this. Science is the great breakdown that you just gave. It's still guided by something. Science is not something external to you. It's not something that imposes itself on you. So when we say that you want to shatter your beliefs, that's not because it's coming from without. You're still the one who's very much an active directing agent in the pursuit of science. And so the all of this is rested on something. I watched this documentary a while back. It's I think it's titled Particle Fever. It's about the discovery of the Higgs boson. And towards the end of it, one of the scientists in it, it's a big, huge thing, 10,000 people involved in this project with the Large Hadron Collider and to discover this Higgs boson. And it was quite an emotional thing towards the end of the documentary to see them kind of with Peter Higgs kind of crying over like they finally, discovered the thing that I proposed 40 years ago or 50 years ago. And the scientist at the end of it said, this is something to the extent of, or to the effect of, this is kind of like the triumph of pure reason. The fact that mathematics works, the fact that the human mind, the power of the human mind to engage in this systematic, logical structure with mathematics, propose something that is not observable, that we don't have direct evidence for, but our mind tells us that this should be there. And then we devise the experiments and we construct the tools and we wait for the technology as it develops to finally allow us to come up with the experiment, to finally see the effect of this and say, finally, we've discovered it and this is the significance of it. So when we talk about science, at least from a Muslim theological perspective, the first thing we recognize is that science is this tool that we make use of. It's not something that tells us how our mind itself is or our pure reason is to be judged, because we use our pure reason to judge it. Mathematics is not something that is tangible, it's in the abstract realm. So if you break existence, all of existence, into like its most fundamental concepts, I'm not talking about just material existence, but existence in general as a whole, you'll find that it actually breaks down into three things from the human perspective. It's either the realm of the material objects, so this is the empirical realm, or it's the realm of events, things happening, or the realm of thought. So how do you think? How are you thinking? Are you being logical? When I say, are you being logical, I'm not asking a scientific question. I'm looking for coherence in your thought pattern. That's not the same as asking, is what you're saying true? Because that's another question that we have to investigate. And then within all of these, you find humans kind of interplay between these realms, back and forth. So if you want to talk about humans from the realm of the objects, you're speaking about the body, you're speaking about the physiology, you're speaking about the anatomy, you're speaking of the material aspect of being human. And then if you talk about the realm of events, people doing stuff. So when we hear about the news or somebody transmitting a piece of news to you, you're not asking a scientific question. You try to ascertain the reality of this. Materialism comes into it. You try to look for effects if there is a material thing that took place. But the event itself, how do you identify that it did happen as it is being told? That's the realm of events, and there's a different method of investigation for that. And then the realm of thought, that's logic now. So now I need to look into your thought pattern. Are you being a logical person or not? The interaction between all of these things develops beliefs. So if I want to examine a belief that I have about the realm of the material world, what do? I have to investigate it using science. And so from that, now you can get a definition of what science is. And so science is can be thought of as it's a process. It's not an effect. It's not a final conclusion. It's a process that's rooted in this method. And this method is devised to investigate the material realm with the goal of identifying consistent or discerning objective patterns that are out there in nature, that are out there in the material world, that is independent of your subjective experience. And discerning those patterns, those real patterns, using mathematical concepts from your subjective perception of patterns. Because our brains, we know from numerous cognitive psychology studies, we're really good at fooling ourselves. We're really good at attributing causation to things that have no causation between them. So we use this mathematics. We use our mind with mathematics, with pure reason, to identify actual patterns that are there from our subjective experience. And the reason we have this subjective experience of false pattern recognition is because our brains just don't have access to all the relevant data. So we use gestalts and heuristics and all of these shortcuts that make us fall into error and define patterns that are not actually there. So we use science as this method for material things to tell us, like, is this pattern that you thought was there, is it actually there? If it's not there, then you have to change your belief about it because it's not true. But that's one aspect. Now you want to talk about thought? Science doesn't come into it. I'm reading right now in my book club with the members, Technopoly by Neil Postman. And in the first chapter of it, it was quite a fascinating point that he brings up, which is how we started to think about thought. We quantified it. We took quality. We took these things that are qualitative in nature and we quantified it. And the reason for it is because to the peril of our success, this is the peril of success. We've technologically advanced. We've gone all of this quantitative advancements, and we started to attribute it to everything, and we started to impose it on everything. And so science becomes this big, great thing, that overarching thing, and it's no longer something that there's two ways of thinking about it. It's either you recognize you're the director of it, you're the active agent in the scientific process, or you falsely believe that it's going to tell you everything about everything. In either case, you're always going to be the active agent. You're still the one engaged in this process. You're the one determining, and that's why, like in this Higgs boson experiment, they did mention the Large Hadron Collider. At the end, they did this unblinding, which is they said we wanted to determine ahead of time using our minds what are the tests what are the thresholds, what are the tests that we're going to use mathematically, what type of statistical methods are we going to use before we look at the data, because we know the second we look at the data, human bias enters into it. But the thing is, your determination ahead of time, that was the thing within itself. It's self-affirming. You're deciding ahead of time, this is how we're going to determine if the Higgs boson exists or not, and then we're going to look at the data. And sure enough, when they did that, they've discovered that sure enough it's there. So pure reason comes in to judge the empirical observation. So you have to, it's this really intricate kind of interplay. And intelligence, as far as I'm concerned, the way I define it, intelligence is your ability to entertain paradoxes that appear to be contradictory to the uneducated or to the ill-informed. For you to entertain these paradoxes that seem contradictory, but they're not necessarily contradictory, and to be comfortable with that and live in the gray zone for a long period of time, sometimes it could be 40, 50 years, until you're able to resolve them. And once you resolve them, then there you go. And if you don't, then you just decide it's never going to be resolved. I don't have to, as long as they don't necessarily contradict with each other and they're just paradoxes. The untrained mind thinks they're contradictory, but they're not. And so science keeps you in this. That's why it's hard to do science. You have to entertain paradoxes for a long period of time, and a lot of people want resolution. They want to be able to say, this is the answer, and that's the way that it is, and it's black or white. I went on for a long time, man.
I would fully steal that phrase, living in the gray zone, and I can already tell you that I'm sure that Matt, the Unicorn Madonna, and Nicole, the Unikitty Page, are probably going to make a t-shirt out of that.
That's great.
Because that is so much of it is that, we very much do live in the gray zone. And even though certain things are resolved and certain things are figured out, there are a lot of problems that haven't been figured out and that haven't been solved. Even, for example, I think what's interesting is, I think one of the big challenges is, as you're talking about that, you use words like logic, right? The ability to resolve contradictions. And right there, I start thinking about atomism and holism, these two complementary mindsets. We certainly don't have a science that yet moves fairly seamlessly between the two. Instead, science is very much siloed, and so there are a lot of conclusions that are reached. For example, in classical economics, where they're reaching those conclusions without real reference to how do human beings actually behave, and so conclusions that they reach are terrible. And that's sort of the big problem is there are these cultural biases that are baked into science without scientists even realizing it. And so a lot of the emergent science makes perfect sense even to scientists. With the data that they have available, the model fits the data. There's the lack of emotional self-awareness to even realize that your thinking is being driven by these very old cultural biases that you picked up from mom and dad because scientists are human.
There's one of the laws of medicine by Siddhartha. Dr. Siddhartha wrote this nice little short essay about the 3 basic laws of medicine. And the third law was, for every perfect medical experiment, there is a perfect human bias. Which is like, so this is science. You have to recognize. And how do you make yourself a name in science? Identify that bias that somebody else had, but at the same time be unaware of your own bias and construct a new experiment that's a little bit better. And wait for somebody else to dismantle your bias.
Well, and that's why it's a collective effort. I mean, I think that's what's interesting about listening to, the beginning of John Haidt's conversation with He Who Shall Not Be Named, is that, John Haidt is talking about how John Haidt is so aware of all of those cognitive biases and all of those problems that for him, the idea that science is a collective effort is not just sort of some principle you pay lip service to. He fully understands this idea that Jesus articulated a long time ago, which is that you see the splinter so clearly in your brother's eye, but you don't see the log in your own. And so science is not something that I could do on my own, even if I wanted to, because the nature of blind spots is you're blind to them. I don't even know what my blind spots are. And so you need somebody who's deliberately out there trying to play devil's advocate and destroy my theory, so that ultimately the models that emerge are better than what I would come up with on my own. And that's why Haidt, for example, is so focused on this heterodox academy and having a really culturally and intellectually diverse community within science to ensure that you don't have a situation where yeah, there's a lot of people who are scientists, but they all have the exact same blind spots.
The reason you need intellectual diversity is because the human mind is so powerful that we sometimes we very easily can be deluded into falling prey into its elusive power, into its believing our own intellectual constructs that we develop of the world, and we project them, and then we think that's reality. So you need somebody else to come in and say, I'm not really sure if that's reality, because there's all of this other stuff that you missed out on, and it's because you have these blind spots. And then you have another person coming in and saying, and you also missed this and that. And so you have this collective. That's why in the Islamic tradition, one of the greatest proofs to use with regards to any ruling, and it's very rarely found in the Islamic tradition, is collective unanimous type of agreement. So if all of the scholars in Islamic tradition across the centuries have agreed on something, that's not very common to find. But it's there. And if they do say that, you can't come in as an individual 1400 years later and say, yeah, I think they all got it wrong. Because as diverse as we are, there's still a limit to the different possibilities that we can generate from a limited text. And so if they all agreed on one particular way, and especially if they come from different backgrounds and different cultures, and they all agree on a particular ruling, then that's the ruling. That's the way to understand that verse. You can't come in 1400 years later with your biases, with your cultural upbringing, with your whatever ideology that you have, and then believe that you all of a sudden are the objective know-it-all who, caught the one thing that literally thousands of people have missed looking at the same text.
Well, and crucially, that I think what's interesting is the degree to which 2016 has revealed a lot of these old problems, where when you have a populace that doesn't have a sort of strong academic and intellectual base, I just compare all of this to being sold a shitty car by a used car salesman, right? So I don't know a lot about cars, and so I'm the perfect sucker for walking onto any car lot, because they can tell me literally anything is wrong with my car, and I'm like, I don't want the thing to blow up or break down, or that'll be really expensive, and maybe this is a problem, and I don't really know what's going on, and okay. You say that this thing is necessary, sure, I'll buy it. So if you don't have a good enough understanding of something, then it means that you are an easy sucker, because you can be sold any bill of goods.
Yes.
And so when you have a populace that doesn't really even understand what science is, or doesn't necessarily understand what Islam is, and this idea of it being this path, and really having been steeped in the history, and sort of then connecting it to this universal problem of human psychology, well, now it's very easy to sell them on whatever bill of goods, and crucially, so Adam Hansen, who was part of the Columbus meetup, and is an innovation guy, one of his big bugbear is the degree to which you get smart points for finding flaws in other people's thinking. So if you come along and you're a guy who just is really able to pick apart and find some sort of apparent flaw in the other person's point by getting really sort of like into the weeds with some sort of very atomistic point, suddenly you look like you've outsmarted this person.
Yeah.
And so it's like a lot of what you're talking about with, because obviously there are modern resonance as to why this bothers you, about people just sort of coming in and suddenly being like, oh, everything that was thought previously about this, this verse of the Quran is wrong. I am the one who has truly understood it, blah, blah, blah. I'm the only authority you can trust. And then guess who? A bunch of young guys who don't know any better end up following.
Well, the thing is, we have this illusion of knowledge nowadays. So you have this mass access to information, and information does not equal knowledge. It's really easy for people, and I know everybody does this. You come across a term, or you come across a concept that you don't know about, and you have this, especially if you have a platform or a position of some kind in social media, which is the virtual world. I mean, think about it, virtual, it's not real. So you're in this virtual world with a platform, and people look up to you, and you come across a concept, you have no idea what it is. Oftentimes, it's probably the first time you even heard of it. You go on Wikipedia, you read quickly, skim through it. and then pretend to be the all-knowing wise person who now can tell everybody about it. And then what do? We hide behind jargon and technical language, which it's just, I hate technical language. I do it right now in medical school all the time. Whenever, I don't care who it is, I always ask, like, what does that mean? And usually it's very simple words that they use, in clinical terms. But then you find out how little people actually understand what that word even means. They just learn to use this word in this context. So this is the context, use this word now. It's like, but what does that mean? I want to know, what does it mean? What underlies this word? And so it exposes ignorance a lot of time, but at the same time, it makes people seem like they're smarter, or it makes them seem like they know what they're talking about. Oh, they're talking in technical language. But oftentimes, this guy just went onto Wikipedia, or this girl just went into some website. Who knows who wrote it up anyways? And they just start speaking about it and start spewing off whatever they want to spew off, and they come across like they're intelligent. And there's this pressure from, have this, and it's, again, virtual. It's not real, guys. Virtual world, this virtual pressure that comes on. Oh, I have a platform, so this thing happens, so now I got to talk about it. And when I talk about it, I need to seem intelligent, so I got to quickly skim through, because this thing is time of the essence. 140 characters, people's attention span is so short. Now I got to go look this up real quick. So Wikipedia is the fastest thing you can do. To do actual research takes time. You got to go and actually read books, and you can't just read like a passage from a book. You got to read the whole thing, because oftentimes, especially if they're older books, that book is a whole. It's a unified whole. The author is relying on you, or assuming that you're going to read the whole thing to understand what this author is trying to say. And the modern world doesn't facilitate that. So you have this illusion of knowledge. Everybody thinks that, oh, I got information, therefore I know what I'm talking about. And then wisdom, the illusion of wisdom. And wisdom doesn't come in these very quick snippets. Wisdom is through experience, through active engagement with a lot of people and experiencing life and actually living the thing that you're talking about. By the way, I'm going to mention the name Sam Harris, because when you don't mention the name, the thing is, huh?
And 5 times.
When you don't name somebody, then you give them like a grandiose kind. I was just like, it just started to bug me too much now. So it's like,
that's all right. And since you've done it, now let's call him by his real name, Derek Zoolander.
Derek Zoolander. That's hilarious, because I noticed this when I first saw his face. I was like, whoa, he looks so much like him.
Crucially, the thing that I love about Derek Zoolander is just there's this great, the great scene at the beginning of Zoolander with the freak gasoline fight accident.
Yeah.
And that's what Sam Harris is engaged in. Like, he's just, he's throwing around all these statistics. He's creating division between tribes.
Yeah.
He's creating lots of people who feel self-righteous. And then he's like, what do you mean this is a guy into some sort of conflict?
God. So here's the thing about him, though, because I'm talking about. Sorry, what were you saying?
Well, and then I was going to say, like, crucially, the other thing too is that he doesn't understand. Like he says, we paint with statistics about the Islamic world, and he doesn't understand that. Yeah, when you paint with statistics, you're painting a picture. It's a mathematical model, idiot.
So here's the thing about painting with statistics and all of this stuff. I'm not going to listen to anybody who's not actually in active engagement with. The thing about him, I have friends who are in faculties of religious studies and Near Eastern studies in different universities. And if you look at the literature on new atheists, and including Sam Harris, Richard Dawkins, all of these people, when they look at them, I ask them, like, how are they viewed within the academic community? People who actually study this as an actual scientific endeavor. They want to understand it. They said they're not taken seriously with any of their arguments. In fact, they're very simplistic and they don't have anything novel to offer. We look at them as a social phenomenon. Now, the thing with Sam Harris, when I speak about wisdom and actually, it's something that you gain from experience, from actually living a thing. I get really annoyed when people identify him as a neuroscientist. Like, for you to be a neuroscientist, I don't identify myself as a neuroscientist, because I'm right at this moment, I'm not engaged in active research because I'm doing a medical degree. Before I did that, I was in research, I got my PhD, but I don't identify as a neuroscientist because I'm not actively engaged in it. There is a type of experiential knowledge and wisdom that you gain from engaging in the activity that is not available to you just by simply propping up a fake degree. And I call his degree fake because if you look at his research, it's fake research. But you don't get it just by having this degree and then propping it up and pretending to be a scientist. He's not a scientist, and that's the thing that would hurt a lot of his followers to hear about. This guy's not a scientist. He's not a religious scholar. He's not a practitioner of any of this stuff, so he has no wisdom. He's got a lot of information because he can go on Wikipedia Wikipedia and just pick up, so these are the books that are important to talk about. And he knows how to search Google with Gallup polls and Pew polls. And then he's got his own bias. So he projects onto it and he picks and chooses whatever he wants. And voila, now I've got this thing and he's got this huge platform. And now everybody thinks he knows something. And so you hear people that speak about, I heard Joe Rogan talk about him in one of the podcasts, like, Sam Harris is really intelligent, this scientist, he's somebody who's, read a lot about this. He's not. The actual people who are involved in this fields rebuke his stuff, don't accept his research in neuroscience, don't accept his statements in religion, and don't view him as anything but an aberration of a social phenomena to be just kind of wondered at from Brentwood. So, yeah.
Brentwood boy hasn't been showing up to tutoring. The tutor of death has some things to say. Yeah, and crucially, the great thing about science is that you do not have to believe either Muhammad or me.
No.
You can go look at the original evidence yourself.
Yes.
And so, go look at William M. Briggs does this breakdown of Sam Harris's PhD. You can go read it. It's 7 parts. And he singles it out as, a really great example of scientism or bad science. You can look at John Haidt, and you can read all of that work and sort of understand what we actually know about the brain.
Mm-hmm.
And on and on and on and on. You can go read all the multi-level selection work by Joe Henrich and David Sloan Wilson, and all of the research on cultural evolution, which he and Dawkins denied. And you can look at the fact that 80% of British scientists have said that they feel that Dawkins misrepresents science. Mm-hmm. Or you can listen to Chris Ryan, who also has a problem with how Dawkins has misrepresented Darwin with this sort of red and tooth and claw interpretation of the way science is, of the way evolution works. Mm-hmm. And if you want, you can also look at the fact that this is, my personal experience having gone to boarding school in England. You can look at the fact that Dawkins is an upper class twit. And that's crucial. But what upper-class twits do, and I think Americans are often in particular dazzled by it, is that there's this great line that came out after Brexit. It was this Financial Times article, and I want to thank my neighbors downstairs for deciding that now they're going to turn my apartment building into Ibiza. But I don't think it'll pick up too much on the microphone. But if there is a ka-chunk in the background, now you know what it is.
All right.
What upper-class twits do, and there was this article about Brexit that said that it was a coup between one set of boarding school boys against another, and that what these upper-class twits do, I'm going to say that again, is that they use humor to deflect anything of emotional difficulty or technical complexity. And that's what Richard Dawkins is that he's an insult comic.
That's interesting.
And he goes around, insulting religious people, which, if you're a new atheist, is entertaining to you. Yeah. And then anytime anybody sort of gives him a difficult question, he just uses some witty quip to deflect it. And again, if you're a young guy who doesn't know any better, you're fooled by that particular part of the trick. But none of this sort of is the work of really wading into a book like Joe Henrich's The Secret of Our Success and seeing, how does this multi-level selection stuff hold up that Dawkins told me is bad. And that's the point, is that, the reason why I've been doing all this stuff is to say, hey guys, you don't have to listen to me, you don't have to listen to any of these guys, because science is not about intuitions of authority. It's about examining the evidence and forming your own conclusions.
So here's the thing, because you mentioned the deflection with humor and mockery and whatnot. In the Islamic tradition, there's a verse in the Quran that says, "O you who believe, let not a people mock another people, for they may be better than them." The Arabic word for mockery, sukhriya, literally means to abase a person, make them lower than you, and elevate yourself. It's a position of arrogance. Now, we're not talking about just having fun games and jokes. We're talking about actually mocking. So when you mock, the problem with mockery is once you elevate yourself, it's like in nature, water does not go up a hill. Water always goes down. If you want to get a drink of water from a mountain, you need to go down so that the water can come to you. You don't go up to the mountain and then call the water to come up to you. So if you want to gain wisdom in this world, if you want to have an understanding, if you want to expose yourself to opportunities of learning, mockery is the fastest way for you to stop all of that and to put a blockade between you and learning. You have to look at other people. I try to never, I have wonderful conversations with atheists, no problems whatsoever. We have our disagreements, but we each leave our conversations having learned something. I always look into the opportunity of engagement as an opportunity to learn. And the same thing with other atheists. But new atheists are in a whole other ballgame. They think they are the paragon of this, upper echelon of society. They're the intellectual elite. They're the ones who've got everything figured out. And so they arrogate themselves and they use mockery to assert this arrogance, which is meaningless. It has no basis whatsoever, because if they engage with the actual technical difficulties of the discussion, they're bankrupt. They have nothing to say. And so they will offer you this facile, straw man type of arguments, and they can never. And so they actually, it's kind of sad. You're preventing yourself from potentially learning some beneficial information.
Well, and crucially, all they have to offer are insults. Like, the amount of quality Photoshop work that is being done to exaggerate my already apparently large nose. It is, it's a real waste of Photoshop talent. Like, if you applied Photoshop talent to moving some of these ideas, you could actually really start to, really create some real attention and some interest around these ideas. And crucially, I think what's interesting, I've been thinking a lot about The Bully Pulpit, which is this book about Teddy Roosevelt in the Progressive era.
Okay.
And the core problem that they were dealing with was one of obliviousness. So, because they're fighting corruption, and the problem is that people didn't sort of systemically understand how problematic corruption was. And so Teddy Roosevelt, there were two things. Teddy Roosevelt, basically as police commissioner and then governor and then president, basically let it be known that he would enforce the law without fear or favor. So he didn't really care who you were. There were laws, and he was going to enforce them equally with everyone. And he made a big spectacle of it. So everybody saw that this was happening. And the more they saw this, the more attention was drawn to it, and the more the public became aware of the problem. Now, some people supported him in that and supported him in calling that out, and some people were pissed off at him. Just because, he was upsetting the status quo. Maybe it was their uncle who was arrested for corruption, and so they were angry at Teddy Roosevelt. What was great was that they then had this protest against Teddy Roosevelt. And what did Teddy Roosevelt do? He showed up to the protest, and he laughed at all the signs that were making fun of him. And because, he's like, oh, wow, you really got me there. And, it was hilarious that you caricatured me and the caricature that you did there. And what's brilliant about this is that now you've robbed them of the ability to tell a story about you.
Fascinating.
Because you were laughing at yourself. You were basically humiliating yourself. And so I think that was what was particularly upsetting for a lot of the new atheists was they would send me these Photoshop pictures of my giant nose. And at some point, they put it up against a picture of a proboscis monkey. And what they didn't realize is that the Indonesians called the proboscis monkey a sunburnt Dutchman. It's so good, guys. You know how good that is? That is really smart because da-da-da-da. And I can't believe that you guys figured that out. And, good on you. And, of course, they didn't know that. But what happens, and this is so much of what nonviolent conflict is about, is that you are deliberately making yourself low. Because when you make yourself low, yes, as you're saying, you're actually in a position to learn. Yeah. But also, crucially, you are you're putting yourself in a position to de-escalate other people's anger. Because now they're in a position of having to try and teach you. And as they try and teach you, that's how their own ignorance is exposed. Because it turns out that they can't really explain the error of your ways.
It's really, I invite all of your listeners, man. Like I tell you, whenever I do this all the time, because I am not shy at all to come across how did you get here? This imposter syndrome. My solution to the imposter syndrome is embrace your imposter syndrome. I don't know how I got to the position that I'm in. There are a lot of things that I don't know. And so when I don't know something, I just ask. I don't care about the embarrassment that it might garner, but even if it's a simple term that I'm supposed to know, well, I don't know it. So tell me what it is. And you'd be surprised how many people pretend to know stuff. And only when you ask, and then, make yourself low, ask the simplest questions about what does that mean even? Forget about how it works. What does it mean when you say this? And you'll find out that a lot of times, like, they don't know. They'll just kind of trip up on their words. They'll try to come up with some rhetorical way to respond, but they won't answer the actual question.
But crucially, you're modeling the right behavior as well. And in terms of how we change the culture of the internet and we start to turn these things around, I mean, I think that's sort of a fascinating thought experiment as well. There's a lot of people on the internet who are sort of trying to pretend that they have it all figured out, which, as pointed out before, is a ridiculous idea, considering there are 130 million books, 60 million scientific articles, 6,000 languages on the planet.
Damn, amazing.
How are you going to try and pretend that you have it all figured out or that you know it all?
Yeah.
So it's an utterly ridiculous thing, and anybody who is adopting that sort of arrogant tone or that arrogant style should be mocked. And I include myself in that if I get caught up in that, because it's very easy to get caught up in those emotional states.
Yeah.
And the point is to be teased out of that. And so, it's the thought experiment. If we all sort of were like, just had this moment of sheepish honesty where we were like, guys, I kind of think none of us know what we're talking about anymore. We've reached that point in the argument. So why don't we just sort of go back to basics, read some books, talk things out, try and figure this thing out together, and just sort of try and clarify things. I mean, it would be amazing how quickly humanity would figure things out.
I mean, I could tell you part of what we do in the medical program is to have these case-based learning. So you get a case of a patient and you get presented with signs and symptoms as you go, and you have to generate hypotheses and such. And oftentimes they'll come up with test results. But then because there's this, there's 10 of us, there's this expectation that if the train is keeping going, everything is moving along, if you don't understand what's going on, then you should just keep quiet and just keep going. But the thing is, after you talk with enough people, you realize that 9 out of 10 people don't know what's going on. They're just assuming that everybody else knows what's going on, and so they don't want to make themselves kind of stand out like, oh, guys, I'm the idiot here. I don't know what's going on. So they don't ask, and so they continue. And I personally, whenever it's my turn to lead the discussion, I'm always back into these basic questions like, can you tell me what that actually means? I mean, we even asked, because we're covering a respiratory module right now, and then we're talking about cough, and I'm like, all right, so what is a cough? And then the initial thing was to explain the mechanism of a cough. I'm like, but what is it exactly? Like, forget about the mechanism. What is going on in a cough? Like, what happens? Why are you coughing? And so what's the reason behind it? And so that's when people start to trip up. I was like, I don't really know. Like, all right, go look it up, because it's actually there. People have asked this question, and this is another thing that I tell all of my listeners on my podcast, and I'll tell your listeners as well. Any question that comes into your mind, there's a very, very strong possibility, 99.9% chance it's been asked before and beaten to the ground and answered. So go look it up, find out. People have asked, and you'll learn something out of it. And if you haven't, then you're the genius in the century who can go and try to figure it out yourself. So,
the way that I explain it in a far cruder way, Mohammed, which is I reappropriate Rule 34. So Rule 34 is, if you can imagine it, there is porn of it.
Yep.
And I think if you can imagine it, there is science of it.
Yeah.
Like at this point, it doesn't matter. I mean, that was, how I found the diffusion of innovations, and, many of the ideas that we've had on Brian Callen's show, Now Mixed Mental Arts, was, I was just like, that thing. I wonder if somebody studied that. And then you poke around, you do some, you do an Amazon search, you do a search in, PubMed or wherever the heck you're looking, right? Google Scholar. And pretty quickly you start to find out, wow, this has been around for 50 years.
Yeah.
That's interesting. No one's applied it. That's interesting.
Yeah.
And, you start to piece together that actually, yes, these answers do exist, and that they have largely been studied, and that, a lot of the work is now synthetic to try and figure out how to piece all of these things together. And that's why we're doing the Mixed Mental Arts Project. But I think, this is a real challenge. This is, I think, the big challenge of our age is, we've accumulated this massive amount of knowledge, and now we have to try and...
We've accumulated a massive amount of information.
Yeah.
Question is how to turn it into knowledge.
Yeah. Well, yeah, and ultimately into wisdom.
Into wisdom, yes.
And that's I think the big challenge of our age. And I think the tool makers have in many senses done their jobs. Like, we have the internet.
Yeah.
We have all of this, these books and the science and all this accumulated information. And now the work of knitting that into wisdom is not something that can be done by computers.
No.
It's something that's by humans.
Yeah.
And it's going to take forming the broadest possible coalition of people who are up for that challenge. And I think also part of it is that we have to, what's going to motivate people to do that is recognizing them when they do socially positive things.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm going to say right now, thank you for translating that TED Talk into Arabic.
That was a challenge, man. Technical stuff in neuroscience and neurology. It was fun, but it was challenging.
But I mean, crucially, that's part of why, what we've been doing with mixed martial arts is there's a reason why I'm making such a point to call out, not just the fundamentalists, but also call out people within the mixed martial arts community who are doing positive things, and to thank those guys in whatever way they're contributing, whether it's someone like Christopher Leon Price, who is editing and mixing all these episodes, or, I mentioned Unicorn and Unikitty doing all their work on T-shirts and designs, Brian Callen for being our emperor, fighting aging one day at a time.
Yeah.
Brian Boya, Matt Maurer. Lots and lots and lots of great people. Kate Fogarty writing knowledge bombs. That is important right there, because it's important to say. I just want to say that whatever the other 7 billion people are excited about on the planet, what I'm excited about is people who are, working with all of this information and figuring out how to share it with other people and to make it accessible and to move those ideas. And whether it's across languages like you, or whether it's within the same language, but really across sort of educational levels and attention span and whatever else.
And to also recognize that the existence of, the persistence of an idea. We just trashed a little bit on new atheists and stuff, but recognize that the popularity or the persistence of an idea, even if it's false, it would not persist had it not had some element of truth within it. And so the challenge is to identify where is the truth and where is the falsehood. So you can reject, you don't want to throw the baby out with the bathwater. So some of this stuff, as much as I can trash on Sam Harris and Richard Dawkins and all these guys, there is some elements of reality, of truth in what they say, even if their delivery is just terrible, and most of what they say I disagree with. I still would have to listen so that I can identify, all right, this is actually a good, valid point. It also helps him bolster his false argument, and that's why it's there, but I can take that valid point and run with it. And so that goes along with anything else. I don't view my position in life or what I believe in as to be to have exclusive access to truth. Everybody has some access to it. The challenge is, how do I identify it so that I can adopt it and make it part of my own?
And so what do you think is the truth that the new atheists offer?
I think their criticism is often misdirected. I see a lot of religious people that pay homage to their religion, whatever the religion is, and they quote all kinds of fantastic verses and lines and things, but their behavior is not translated. I don't see it in behavior. And so the new atheist reaction, aside from any other interest that they may have, part of the reaction, I think, has to do with, well, you guys might say all of these things, but when I look at your behavior, I'm not seeing it realized on the ground. And so when I see outliers, people like, for example, Mother Teresa or Gandhi or any of these kind of figures in history, when I see them and you attribute their behavior to religion, I don't attribute it to religion. I attribute it to an outlier. This is not religion that made them that way. They're just a good person. Because when I look at most religious people and their behavior is not really exemplary. If anything, I can now attribute it to, well, the religion tells them to behave that way. And so therefore, there is that validity. The thing about it, this is another law of medicine from Dr. Siddhartha, where she says, normals teach us rules, outliers teach us laws. Normals, so this is the normal behavior that you see, that kind of tells you the rule of thumb, let's say, of this particular religious group. So Muslims, by and large, you see some negative behavior that's persistent across the board. I can see why you can attribute it to the religion, because you're seeing a lot of Muslims that behave in that way. Well, you have to own that. Me as a Muslim, I was like, you know what, you're right. This particular thing, that's a problem, and we need to deal with it. And the way to deal with it is not to say, get rid of Islam. The way to deal with it for me as a Muslim is, well, what does your tradition actually teach? Because I can't trust behavior. I need to look into what the religion teaches, especially if I know that the level of religious literacy is not that high. A lot of Muslims are born into Muslim families and they identify as Muslims, but if you go down to the nitty-gritty and ask them, what does your religion actually teach? They will come up with normative cultural things to say, not necessarily religious things. It may coincide, but it may not necessarily be the same thing. So the way that we, in my work, try to kind of make it clear is I try to get people back to, all right, let's see what the religion actually says, what the Quran says, how the Prophet, Muhammad, peace be upon him, lived, and I'll go through that with them and try to explain. Religion is hard. Religion requires you to, religion expects more out of you than you expect out of yourself. It expects you to transcend your own self, to transcend your own ego and your own whims and your own desires. To transcend your own self-interests so that you can look at a bigger picture and look at reality in a more kind of encompassing way. And a lot of people fail religion. It's not that religion failed us. We failed religion. So they have that. So I look at their criticism. It's like their criticism has some validity to it, but it's directed at the wrong thing. They're confusing the finger for the moon.
Well, and I mean, crucially, the irony of all of this is the position that science now finds itself in, where at the core of science there is this perfect principle that people should change their minds in light of evidence. Mm-hmm. But if you look at how, what is, the global population of people who are either practicing scientists or, the sort of the laity that identifies with science, whether it's the new atheists or, the sort of the young guys and gals who read things like I fucking love science, or the people who go around and just sort of hashtag, because science is a sort of quick response.
Because science.
Yeah, I mean, it's the same psychology.
Yeah.
It's that young person's psychology of, I don't really understand this stuff. I don't understand the complexity of it. I haven't really waded into the arguments. I don't know how to unpack it. But what I'm really saying is my tribe is better than your tribe, and I don't really have to engage in these arguments.
I mean, if I want to blame science, if I want to play that game and just do like kind of the devil's advocate, if I want to behave like the new atheist with regards to science, I could come in and say, look at what science has given us. Given us atomic bombs, the threat of thermonuclear warfare right now. It's given us climate change. It's given us separation between families because look at all the technology that it provided for us so that we can split up. It provided ways for us to cheat on each other. So with all of these different dating apps and these websites that come up, it provided. So I can point at all of these things and it's like science is evil and we need to get rid of science because that's the only way for us to move forward. That is a silly. Anybody who's got two cells in their brain would recognize how simplistic and stupid that type of argument is. But that's essentially what these guys are doing with religion. Instead of looking at the behavior of the people and go like, listen, the way that you're approaching this thing and doing it and claiming to be an advocate for it doesn't really mesh well with the actual teachings of it. You know what I mean? So you have to look at the individual as the human being, and that's the difficult thing for us to engage in self-reflection and go like, the problem is more within than without. From an Islamic perspective, the material manifestation of things in the world is only a byproduct of an internal state. It's all within you. Like in the Quran, it has a verse that says, God does not change the condition of a people, in other words, the external condition of a people, until they change what's within their own selves. So if you...
That's the whole thing, is that's that self-reflection. That's the real work. Is realizing that, the biggest obstacle in your life is you and your own emotional baggage, which you picked up from your family and your environment. And that there is this process of unpacking that over time. And I mean, the analogy that I like to use is, those Russian nesting dolls, the matryoshka. And, that is really like, you're born into the world, you haven't picked up anything from your culture yet. And then at a certain point, you start to get old enough that you start doing some reflection. You start to notice, I'm starting to sound like my mother, or, oh my God, that's what my father would do. And then you begin the fun process of unpacking the Russian nesting doll. Which you will be doing for the rest of your life.
Yeah.
And at a certain point, when you've unpacked the Russian nesting doll enough, you're at that point realizing that you're not really in a position to judge anybody.
Yeah.
Because, if you were born into their position in, for example, Brentwood, then you probably would have all the same wacky beliefs, and make the same terrible choices and have all the same insecurities. So, but I think, to get back to your point about, how you could selectively tell a story of science that makes science look terrible, that is exactly the story that I heard very often at Oaks Christian, which is a school that was set up, fundamentally to teach the controversy in such a way that evolution would lose. And that's, for me, that was a big experience in terms of that universal problem of tribalism and Hatfield and McCoy tendency that human beings have to tell narratives about our own people that make us seem like the good guys and we've done all the most wonderful things, and then to tell stories about the other guys that they're just worthless pieces of shit and are the source of all the world's problems. And it's super easy to do, and I think it's particularly easy to do with religion because very often, it's a false equivalence. You're comparing, people who lived in the Bronze Age or the Stone Age and, didn't have the same material wealth, didn't have the same knowledge and understanding, and therefore, of course, there was a much more violent time. There were all these other problems like famine and plague. And it's not that they weren't trying to make sense of these things. It's not that they didn't want to understand how disease happens so they could prevent it. They had medicine. It just wasn't very good. And a large part of the reason it wasn't very good is because they didn't have the tools, both the cognitive tools of understanding the scientific method and then also just the raw physical tools of petri dishes and microscopes and everything else. Like glass grinding technology, if you read Stephen Johnson, can't remember which of his books, but it's 4 Innovations That Changed the World or something. But, he really sort of goes through the process of what it took to make technology like glass lenses. And it took a long, long time, and crucially passing back and forth between lots of different cultures before, humanity, and it really was an achievement of humanity, evolves the glass lenses that make microbiology possible.
So I want to push back on one thing: the not having the cognitive tools to engage in the scientific method. I think it's more about technological advancements than it is about scientific method per se. If we think about the scientific method as in, I do an action, I look at the effect, I do it again, I confirm the effect. I do it a third time to confirm that it's working out that way, and because this is the information that I have, this is the access to this level of the empirical realm that I have due to the technology that I have. So therefore, this is what I think that's going on. So then I get new technology come about. I have the lenses. I can look at things at microscopic levels. So now I can adjust my model. I'm still engaged in the same process, but now I'm adjusting my model to take into account all of these things that I didn't know existed before because I didn't have the technology. So I'm sensitive to the idea of looking at past peoples as cognitively inferior than us because they didn't engage in the scientific method the way that we do. We're technologically superior in a way, but I think cognitively speaking, it's just because we have access to levels to dimensions, microscopic dimensions that they didn't have, so they couldn't even think about these things. It's like trying to ask you to imagine something that you've never seen in your life and don't have no concept of it. So when it comes to bacteria, nobody knew what that was. They didn't have any knowledge of it. Technology comes about, exposes it, they engage in the same process, but they adjust their model now.
I think just to clarify that, I'm not saying that they're cognitively inferior.
Yeah.
I don't think that human nature has changed much.
Okay.
We've been reading the data in a very long time. Certainly not in the 10,000 years since the rise of agriculture.
Yeah.
So I don't think that's the thing. When I'm saying that they didn't have the sort of the intellectual tools, it's clear that there is an evolution of just even mental constructs. Mental constructs are tools, and they get better over time.
Yes.
And things like, for example, colors. When you look at the Old Testament or you look at the Odyssey, there's no blue. And the sort of the basic colors just hadn't evolved. They hadn't thought to split up the color spectrum in that kind of way. Have special words for different portions of the electromagnetic spectrum. So the sea is always just described as dark. And so that and there's lots of great work in Henrik's Secret of Our Success about even the relative clause So only languages of a certain size have enough people working on the language essentially to refine it enough to have something like the relative clause.
So I would also push against that and say, are we projecting what we think is important about describing the ocean? That I have to describe it in terms of color, as opposed to put yourself in that person's shoes, in the writers of the Odyssey and the writers of all these great works, and look at what they thought was important to describe. Maybe color was not so essential to come up with. There's some linguistic theories with regards to the ability to with regards to the link between our language constructs and our thinking processes, and there is some pushback against that. It's not a settled matter. It's a contentious issue. So we can't just look at language. What's that?
You mean Sapir-Whorf?
Yeah.
Yeah, which, I mean, my linguistics professor in college taught me Sapir-Whorf. Bert Vox, by the way, is the person that Sapir-Whorf was bunk.
Yeah.
It's not so much that, and I mean, it's so to give an example, it's more like apparently, in English the past tense is does, so like I walked or I loved, and that duh originally was done.
Okay.
If you look at a lot of sort of hunter-gatherer languages that are only spoken by a few hundred or a few thousand people, they will still say things like I walked done. And then over time it collapses down and becomes this essentially ending that you stick on the end.
It's like LOL now, the development of like...
Exactly. So the language gets polished and refined down, and there's a collapse towards, and this is something that Bert Vox does say, there's a simplification of the language where, like any sort of tool, it's being sharpened and refined to be able to more effectively communicate concepts with less and less work.
But does that have a necessary link to cognitive processes per se?
Well, it improves the ability to communicate. So, for example, I think in terms of changes that we have been seeing and that we are going to be seeing. Think about, for example, what is the vocabulary around the brain and around practice, or around cultural evolution, or does the words like atomism and holism exist? And I don't when they were coined, but they're not in they're not in wide circulation yet. Those are words that, or the phrase the Dunbar number. Those are things that I intentionally aim to popularize and show what they're practically useful. And if you succeed in doing that, they'll then become part of the standard vocabulary. Now, in practice, what do I think is going to happen? Do I think that the culture is going to respect the sort of terms like the Dunbar number? Well, no, probably not. They're probably going to reshape it and find other ways to express the same concept. In fact, there's a guy at Cracked who refers to it as the monkey sphere.
Okay.
There's sort of the monkey sphere is, your monkey brain has these limits, and you can sort of only conceptualize 150 people, and then beyond that, everything is sort of an abstraction. But in practice, there will be a competition between these different ways of expressing these same concepts, and people will find better and better terms. So, we had Jordan Peterson on talking about how some kids on college campuses want these 70 different gender pronouns. Yeah. Well, let's imagine that you somehow manage to legislate that in one generation. What do you think happens in the next generation? Nobody's using 70 gender pronouns, right? We had, in English, we used to have thou and thy. Yeah. And then at some point, speakers were like, well, that's not useful. Yeah. They ditched it. They dropped it. So there are selection pressures that go on within language in terms of the ability to convey information
more efficiently,
and even how the words are pronounced. So constantly, kids are trying to do this, right? They turn spaghetti into paschetti because it's easier to pronounce. Yeah. Or they say, I eated the paschetti, right? Yeah. Oh, they try to regularize it. And left to their own devices and allowed to do that, they would do that. And so when you look at verb tenses and you compare, what the modern language looks like compared to the ancient language, there has been this simplification that has gone down to make things more pronounceable, to make structures easier to use, to regularize things, and to be able to convey more information with less information. So, and again, a lot of this is all in the secret of our success. And
I'm still having trouble finding the link between that and how did we jump from simplifying and making more efficient use of language as a communication device, so it's a tool.
Yeah.
How does that reflect on our cognitive process itself? So if I'm having I'm having some thoughts, some people can take longer to express their feelings or their thoughts, and I may take a little bit shorter time because I've gone through some education system, and so now I have more access to more efficient use of vocabulary. But that doesn't necessarily mean that I'm in a way my cognitive process is superior to that person simply because I have a better tool of expressing myself. In fact, I could express a wrong idea more efficiently, and they could express a right idea but take longer to do it. I'm not sure where the link is between the language and the cognitive process.
Well, it comes down to what intelligence is, right?
Uh-huh.
So, the word intelligence comes from the Latin root interlegere, to choose between.
Okay.
And you hear the same idea in the wisdom to know the difference.
Okay.
So that's what these rule of thumbs allow you to do. They allow you to quickly discern between two options.
Mm.
And when you have, for example, take something like, this is what I deal with students all the time. They make a mistake. How do they respond to that mistake? And, a student who is not an effective student, who doesn't have good decision making, will feel ashamed of that mistake. They'll personalize it. They'll try and cover it up. They'll make all sorts of excuses and on and on and on. A student who has become an effective student doesn't waste that time. So what ends up happening is they make a mistake and they've learned the response of being either, embracing it or even better, being curious about it and trying to figure out why that happened and wanting to unpack that. And they've learned to depersonalize it, and they have a whole vocabulary then beyond that of how to even analyze that mistake and say, oh, this was a problem of, not reading it, of not finding the rule, of not being able to do that. So what happens is that you're very quickly able to sort through a mass of information and pick an issue. That's very much the same thing. I mean, my grandfather's family were all doctors, going back for generations. And my grandfather, after all these generations of being doctors, had come down to two core principles. One, leave it alone. In general, the body is much better at fixing itself than its harm. So if in doubt, it's very much the Hippocratic Oath, do no harm. And two is that the reason why you get paid big bucks as a physician, why you're the best physician in town, is not because you can lance a boil or administer an injection. Anyone can do that, and they can do it very well. The real thing is diagnosis.
Yes.
It's the ability to sort through a complex, massive system and find the signal and the noise. And that's what wisdom is about. And I think that what I find interesting about the scientific method is the fact that the scientific method is what we already do.
Yeah.
Like we already, have beliefs, and then we notice at some rate that there is a conflict between the evidence and what's happening and what we believe, and then that belief shatters. And so that process was already happening in human history long before the scientific method shows up. What the scientific method does is it formalizes that process so that you can more rapidly go through those steps. And so, why do you have this, formal process and you have to declare a hypothesis? Well, that forces you to quickly extract your belief, put it out on the paper, be really formal and clear about it, and let everybody see what it is so we know what we're testing, right? And then you define methods, define, observations, blah, 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 blah.
That actually is the best. Right now, what you just said, that is the best description of, or the best way to explain what is the difference between the use of the scientific method in the modern world versus the use of it in the past. We've externalized it, we've categorized it, we've put it together, we've formalized it, as you said, and then we engage in it, and it makes it more rapid to get through the process, and that's why we're advancing so quickly. So that's a fascinating way of putting it. Rather than negate the past people completely and say like they were intellectually inferior, therefore we figured it out, scientific method, we're better.
I think that's the point. Is that's because you have to go back to the beginning of science, right? If you go back to, I just think you have to think about what was the historical experience of the people who were sort of first experimenting with the scientific method. And they're living in the shadow of the European wars of religion.
Mm-hmm.
So when you watch your countrymen kill each other over who is more living the principles of Jesus, you're abundantly clear that humans can believe literally anything and justify their behavior.
Yeah.
And you want all sorts of trivial fights over whether you should eat sausages or not escalates these massive, like, town-wide conflicts and just everybody go nuts. So I think profoundly you have a sense of humility and awareness of your ability to believe wacky things.
Yeah.
And so in that crisis, in that problem environment, you're then forced to invent much, much better tools for how do you deal with this problem of human belief.
Yeah.
I think it's a dialectic. It's a response to the challenge that they were dealing with. And so there was this thing that humans naturally do. Yeah, they just formalized it.
Yeah.
Speeds it up. And I think that, part of the problem that I become aware of in terms of doing the experimental arts is, well, we're in that problem again. Like 2016, anybody who watched it sees that there is this problem of beliefs. But what most people aren't aware of is the degree to which those conflicts between beliefs are not being resolved even within academia based on the evidence on any sort of timeline that anyone can appreciate, because it is this, the Planck problem of science proceeding one funeral at a time.
Yeah.
And the evidence on cultural evolution, in my opinion, and I'm not the final arbiter of this, again, everybody should look at the evidence, but the evidence on cultural evolution is pretty damn clear. They've got the culture to evolution is pretty damn clear. It's obvious that some people have lactose persistence and some people don't.
Mm-hmm.
And that the people who co-evolved with dairy have lactose persistence.
Mm-hmm.
So just to try and say that, evolution is not happening at multiple levels, which is what multi-level selection is all about, I just don't know how you sort through all that evidence
and then claim that it's not there.
And, especially when you're supposedly promoting, and crucially, a lot of it comes down to more clearly defining what Dawkins' position is, which is gene-centric evolution, acting as if it's all about genes or that it's overwhelmingly about genes.
Yeah. Well, he's an ideologue, so he's going to have to hone in on one thing and just say that this is the way that it is. And if you look at his career even, he's not necessarily his biggest contribution to science, as far as I'm aware, and I could be wrong, is his the meme thing, which was back from the 70s, which is not even a scientific theory or a hypothesis that is testable. You can't really get at it. I read a thing by E.O. Wilson just criticizing the whole thing, and it's like, so he's got this big kind of name because of his popularization of these ideas and popularizing evolution, and he's great at that, but he kind of erected a false image of it, and didn't encourage people to become more aware of, didn't encourage people to engage in the scientific process as it is. Rather, he's giving an ideology of science, and that's what scientism is, which creates this ugly kind of unfortunate also rejection of science by people who feel that it's attacking them, because now it becomes a war of ideologies as opposed to this is a process of investigation, guys.
And I can tell you that that's exactly what has happened, having actually spent time on the other side of the conflict.
Mm-hmm.
That is exactly what happens in places like Oaks Christian.
Mm-hmm.
Everybody, because of the Dunbar number, if you're a kid at Oaks Christian, or you're any of the teachers there, or you're on the other side of any conflict, how many scientists do most people know? Most people don't know many scientists.
That's true. Yeah.
And so what are you relying on for forming your stereotype of a scientist? Well, it's going to be a few key figures. Like, there aren't any charismatic scientists, and so they trot the same four guys out on TV.
Exactly.
Neil deGrasse Tyson, Bill Nye the Science Guy, Richard Dawkins, and apparently Sam Harris.
Oh, and now it's Lawrence Krauss, too.
And Lawrence Krauss.
Yeah.
But, there's a sameness to all of those,
yeah.
where, not so much, Bill Nye the Science Guy and Neil deGrasse Tyson aren't quite so hostile to religion as a whole.
Yeah.
But overwhelmingly, the message is
the message is clear. Drop your religion. Yeah. This is the way that you were going to move forward.
And so obviously, your religious faith is important to you and it's important to belonging in your community, then now there's, people talk about, it comes down a lot to talent clusters, right? We know that blind copying happens because you see someone who you think is like you, you could to be, and so therefore that's your role model, and you want to be just like them. I mean, if you, by contrast, let's imagine a situation where, guess what, the 5 most famous scientists are people like Muhammad, and they're all Muslim.
Yeah.
I mean, you would have a very different reaction in the Muslim world, where suddenly young Muslim kids would be like, oh my God, I want to be like Muhammad. No, I want to be like Hamid, right?
Yeah.
And it would be a totally different experience. So it's not to say that, I think that the key thing is, why does somebody become an ambassador of science versus not? Well, there's certainly no formal selection process. That selection process is done by the media, but it's part of what is the criteria on which the media selects for who gets to be on TV. And it's people who speak in sound bites are inflammatory, and there's a reason why, for example, John Haidt and Joe Henrich and David Sloan Wilson and all of that crowd are not on TV.
Well, Noam Chomsky said that. Like, why doesn't he get invited to come and give his input on what's going on in the world? And I remember him saying in one long interview, he said they tried it once with me and they said never again, because he's not a soundbite guy. Things are more complicated than to just give a quick black and white inflammatory type of answer. And so unfortunately Neil Postman has another book, Amusing Ourselves to Death. I really recommend people pick that up. Amazing book, because he just shows like how these figures kind of come up and become the paragons of societies, like, oh, these are the guys that we look up to, and why we should not be looking up to them, because they're not the examples to, they don't speak for the enterprise.
Well, crucially, they're antithetical to it.
Yes.
And that's why John Haidt called out Derek Zoolander, because he's litigious, and that is not what the scientific mind is about. And that's the problem is that people like John Haidt, who are humble and who are on that search and are on that path, are not good for TV, because you're going to have John Haidt, be interviewed by someone, and then they're going to say, this is the real problem, this group of people. And then John Haidt will be like, well, actually, if we weren't really talking about the research and we weren't really talking about its work, this is a shared problem of human psychology. So we really have to look at how we're all contributing to these narratives and creating these problems. And tribalism is a problem everywhere. And well, what, John Haidt? You just killed the argument. Yeah. Because now you've moved the conversation from, oh, great, it's all that other group's fault, and I get these pleasing feelings of self-righteousness and confirmation bias, to now, firstly, I'm in the gray zone of cognitive dissonance, which that's comfortable and doesn't necessarily make for very popular TV. And now, also, I'm part of the problem. And I have to reflect on my own behavior and potentially change my own behavior in light of evidence. This is horrible, John Haidt. This is bad TV.
Well, he even talks about his own personal experience in The Righteous Mind when he talked about going to that village in India.
Yeah.
I don't know if you recall, but it was quite a fascinating kind of almost an autobiographical account of his own intellectual crisis, going through and seeing them behave in the way that they behaved and interact with each other in the way that they interacted. And he said, me as a weird person, white, educated, liberal, whatever, like all the titles, I can't remember the acronym, the whole thing.
Industrialized, rich, and democratic.
So he's like, me coming into that community and with my biases, and all of a sudden his biases became apparent to him. So his reaction is not usual. His reaction to think about, why am I feeling like this? Why am I having this emotional reaction to what I'm observing in this village? Before I start judging them, why am I judging them in the first place? What are my biases? How did I come up to this? And, The Righteous Mind is a great book to kind of explore, although he's more in people try to say that, it's more applicable to Republican versus Democrat. I think it has a more wide-spanning kind of umbrella that you can apply with some freedom of choice of what you can kind of take from it. Because he does speak about, he exposes these things, and he teaches you, like, all right, when you feel this way, recognize where it's coming from. Ask yourself, is this the elephant that's reacting right now? And you're just going to let it kind of direct you wherever you want to go and rationalize everything that you do? Or are you going to take charge a little bit and try to direct some of that behavior.
And I think crucially, part of what's so uncomfortable about the whole rider and elephant is that you actually don't know. It's not, the big problem is that people often think when you start talking about emotions that you're only talking about those times when you're being super obviously emotional.
Not at all.
Right? High keyed up fear, really strong anger, really strong joy or love, where the feelings are so strong and so obvious that it's clear that they're driving your choices. But the elephant is always there.
Yeah, it's very subtle.
It's very subtle, and very often you're like, what the heck is this elephant up to right now? Is it up to something? Is it being problematic? Is it, sort of slowly veering towards the left, or, maybe stomping its feet a little bit here? What is going on? And so it is this, that's why it takes so long to engage in that self-reflection, is because you have to just watch the elephant a lot, be able to observe its patterns, spot its patterns, figure out where those patterns came from, and then be able to work through nudging the elephant, off of that course and onto a more reasonable path.
So from an Islamic perspective, because we have a bit of a breakdown on this, because it's not just the elephant in Islamic theology. Islamic cosmology recognizes there are different components to what makes you who you are. So you have the self, or the lower self, we call it the ego, the nafs. You have also the ruh, the spirit, your soul. You have demonic inspirations. So we actually, the concept of the unseen, this ghaib is what we call it in Arabic. The unseen is this world that is metaphysical. It's beyond this. You can't measure it with any tools. You don't have access to it through the scientific method, but it exists. We believe that it exists. So that's where angels and demons come in. And demons give you inspirations, angels give you inspirations, your soul gives you inspirations, and your ego gives you inspirations. And then we have a breakdown of how do you identify which one is giving you this, the inspiration, and how to combat it back. And that's why in the hadith, in the tradition of the Prophet, he said after they came back from a battle where they were fighting, he said, we've come back from the lesser jihad, from the lesser fight, to the greater jihad. Now you're going to go back home and going to have to deal with these four issues, four aspects of your existence, where your ego and your demonic inspirations are going to come back at you all day long. And there are ways to identify which one is which so that you can figure out how to combat it back. And that is a lifelong battle that doesn't end until you pass away.
And that greater jihad is absolutely, that's the challenge. That's the challenge of the human experience, I think, crucially. And I think that's the reason why the righteous mind has resonance as far beyond Republican and Democrat, is because that's the challenge of human history, of the human experience. Mm-hmm. And I think that these, the great teachers of the past, people like Jesus and Muhammad and the founding fathers and Adam Smith and, Charles, not so much Darwin, but, they were really just trying to make people aware of their own psychology and to get them focused on that greater jihad. Mm-hmm. And it's just been a series of doing that at greater and greater levels.
Yep.
Where, Muhammad was trying to, deal with the problem of tribalism within the Arabian Peninsula and to create a larger group. Jesus was trying to, how big were Jesus' ambitions? I don't know. I don't have a good enough view of the New Testament, but certainly he was focused on this problem of the Samaritans, the Judeans, where he's like, these two tribes that have these complex narratives about each other, and, let's try and defy those categories by giving people a story of the Good Samaritan, and now that's a real problem, because now what I realize that I have to focus on is not what is your tribal affinity, but what is your behavior.
Yeah.
And that's the big pattern that keeps emerging. There's this, I had a conversation with Big Mike, and, what he was really talking about was stop looking at what people's, political affiliation is or what their cultural affiliation is, and look at people's behavior.
There's a circumstance that happened where one of the companions of the Prophet converted to Islam, and then there was a verse in the Quran that speaks about that Christians have taken and Jews have taken their rabbis and their priests as gods before God. They have associated them with God. And so this companion said in response, he's like, we didn't worship them. We weren't prostrating in front of them. We weren't giving them homage or anything like that. And the Prophet said, yeah, you weren't saying these things, but here's a question for you. Did you make permissible what they said is permissible, and did you make impermissible what they said was impermissible? In other words, did you behave in accordance with what they told you to behave? And he said, yes, that's exactly what we did. He said, that's your worship of them. That's how you... So it's not your declarations. You can talk about, oh, you believe in one God all day long. But if your behavior is contrary to that, then we got a problem. So you can talk about charity and giving and caring about the family and family values and all of the stuff. I don't care which party you're associated with. If you're a serial cheater who appoints people to destroy the environment, I don't care how many times you tweet about how you wish Happy Earth Day when you're trying to destroy the environment with your behavior. So yeah, look at behavior. People can say all kinds of stuff. I don't pay attention to that. What are you doing?
Yeah. And I think, ladies and gentlemen, that's the point, is that in the end, it doesn't matter really what religion people profess, whether they profess to be a scientist or not, whether they've managed to decorate themselves with enough pieces of paper, enough context, and the robes and the fancy hats and whatever else to try and convince you that they are a particular thing. That's all superficial. That's window dressing. Mm-hmm. It's no different than Kim Kardashian's greasy butt.
It's like a wedding cake.
Yeah, it's the real core is, really, and this is the challenge, and I think in terms of knowing a lot of, this cultural evolution research, that's why I think I'm hopeful, which is that so much of it is that humans start superficial.
Yeah.
It's not that we are superficial, it's that we start superficial. And then over time, we begin to work our way into the core. And crucially, all you have to do is you have to shatter the illusion and pull back the curtain on the wizards and get people to look at really, what is this person doing? What is the pattern of their behavior? How do they think? What is motivating them? Mm-hmm. And then, you come to understand who this person is and what makes them tick. And then you can start to look, are they really living the principles they profess? Are they practicing what they preach? And that's really all you can ask of any human being. Because in practice, as you said, or rather as Dr. Siddhartha said, is Dr. Siddhartha the Buddha?
No. I think Siddhartha is his last name, but the book is The Laws of Medicine. I'm just going to look it up now just so that I don't butcher the Laws of Medicine.
It's not Siddhartha Mukherjee.
Mukherjee, yeah, that's it.
Oh, it is Mukherjee. Oh,
yeah.
Okay. Because I know him from the Emperor of All Maladies.
Yeah, the Emperor. Exactly, that's the guy.
Okay, so yeah. Siddhartha Mukherjee. So, but yeah, I mean, this concept that you brought up in terms of you look to normals for rules and you look to outliers for principles.
Yeah.
And that's really the point. Is that, and this is like from my own limited knowledge of Islam. That is so much of it, as is true in so many cultures. It's about looking to exemplary individuals and modeling your behavior on the exemplary individuals.
Exactly.
And that's why I try and be like Brian Callen every day. I fall short. Again. But I keep trying.
Just keep at it, man. One day. You will get to the point where, I mean, you don't look like you'll probably be along the same lines. By the time you get his age, you won't be aging.
I won't. I'll be reverse aging.
You'll be reverse.
But yeah, I mean, that's the nature of the game. Is to you're going to have role models. The question is, who are your role models?
Yeah.
And how much are you really struggling to emulate? The people whose actions are most admirable in history.
Well, we have a statement in Arabic, تشبه بالكرام إن لم تكن منهم إن التشبه بالكرام فلاح, which means be like or emulate as much as you can the noble ones. Take the exemplars, be like them, try to pretend to be them. Because if you're not them, if you're not a noble one yourself, even in emulating them as much as you can, there is a success in that. You will get somewhere with that. So yeah, pick the highest ideals and try to be, and recognize your humanity as well. I mean, as much as we like to say like, oh look, make sure that behavior is always coinciding with proclamations. At the end of the day, we're still human beings. We have our own inconsistencies and our own paradoxes and our own shortfalls and shortcomings. People err, people fall down, but you look for kind of an overarching direction or trajectory in which that person is going. This person is a scientist. They might have this quirk here or there where they don't really fall in line with what they actually proclaim all the time. But overall, this person is somebody who follows the evidence where it takes them.
And then crucially, I think then use your failures. I mean, firstly, use your failures to be reminded of how difficult this is and how easy it is to fall into these traps of arrogance and condescension and complacency and all of that. And then also use those failures, call those failures out in front of the community.
Yeah.
So that the community can then call you out and hold you accountable.
Yeah.
So I think that's the key thing is that, it really is a process. And, I'm a big fan of Rudyard Kipling's If. And there's this great line where he talks about treating triumph and disaster both for the imposters that they are.
Yeah.
And they are. I mean, in the momentarily triumph, you can get emotionally wrapped up in triumph and think that it's great. But if you look at human history, you'll find that again and again, people become victims of their own success.
Yeah.
So if triumph is so great, then how come it consistently screws people up?
Yeah.
And by the same token, disaster is the greatest teacher. Though, is disaster good or bad? And, that's where the parable of the Chinese farmer comes in. Good or bad, too soon to tell.
Yeah. I love that parable.
It's a great.
I mean, the thing about triumph and disaster is it depends on your response to them. If you're going to take your eye off the prize, which is the process. I mean, I look at goal setting and triumphs and disasters as kind of markers throughout the process of learning and the path that you're on. If you think that the triumph or the disaster is the be-all or end-all, then you're going to fail ultimately, and you're going to lose track of where you're supposed to be going. People wonder, like, oh my God, you've done a PhD. I even taught an undergraduate course in brain and behavior. I was going on this track of becoming a professor, and then I drop all of that, and I go into medical school and, go with people that are 10 years younger than me in this program. It's like, what are you doing? It's like, I'm in a process. Getting a PhD or having these accolades it's nice, I collect them along the way, but that's not what it's about. I'm seeking something. I'm trying to answer some questions. And so these things, I don't look at life as a linear progression in that way, that I get this, then I'm done. Then I can sit down. Once you think that you're done, you've died. Only dead trees don't grow. Trees that are alive, they continue to grow, and they don't stop at any point.
Yeah, and that's the point, is that it's a process. And I think that's the key thing is, and crucially, how quickly is that process going? Because, are you actively, and I think that's what I really appreciate when you talk to someone like Spiros and when you talk to you, is that, there is you've moved from, sort of being like, oh, I guess failure is part of the process, to an active seeking out of failure. Because you understand that the adjacent possible to failure is something better.
Yeah.
And when that fails, there will be something better on the other side. And so the key is, and this is in terms of speeding up science, right? The formalization of the scientific method speeded up. But we now have the knowledge and the understanding to further speed up science by really creating a culture that is constantly de-jargonizing, making ideas accessible, bringing as many minds to the party, and then actively courting, rapid failure, fail fast.
Yes.
And that's, very much, I think, the project that both of us are on. And, I think that one of the opportunities of the internet and, part of the clarity of focus that, our own culture wars of 2016 brings about is...
2017, Hunter. You've been saying 2016. I'm sure people are getting bugged by this.
I mean, I sort of tracked this 2016 and sort of hoped that 2017 was going to be a turning point. It looks like culture wars are extending into 2017. So I think, using 2016 was hopeful that it would end.
Yeah.
But it looks like the sectarian violence is going on Twitter.
You know what? There is a beautiful poem by a Moroccan or a Tunisian scholar, and he composed it. It's a prayer, and the prayer begins with, "O difficulty, get more difficult so that you may become dissipated." So there's this idea, it's like the cousin of the Prophet, Imam Ali. He said that the darkest portion of the night is the one right before dawn. So if you were looking at 2017 as like the age of Trump and alternative right and post-fact and all of this post-truth and all this madness, I look at it as, this is great. We need to get to the worst position that we need to get to so that we can finally wake up and we can have the break of dawn show up. So
we need to hit bottom.
Yeah, we need to hit bottom. Only when we hit bottom and somebody gets a concussion, they recognize, like, whoa, I was in the wrong direction. I need to be going up.
Yep. And see, there you go, ladies and gentlemen. Again, the embracing and the active seeking of failure is the way to open up that better adjacent possible.
Yeah.
So there you go, guys. I think that's a good note to end on. That, it is darkest before the dawn, and that, there is inevitably, I think what's interesting is that I think there are more and more people who are sort of fed up with the old culture of, superficially celebrating for people for things that either aren't accomplishments or that are remarkably dumb or socially destructive. And I think that there are more and more people who are feeling like we either have hit bottom or that, bottom is very close around the corner.
Mm-hmm.
So, Mohammed,
Hunter,
thank you so much for coming on Mental Arts and being in the dojo.
Thanks for having me, man.
I owe Waleed some sort of symbol of gratitude. I know that as soon as I tell him that, he's going to say, how much is pay? Which is a favorite thing to say to me. And I will say, Motivation 3.0 is its own reward.
Yeah. That's true.
And, one of the things I know that you, let's just do all the plugs, because Andalus Online is the place to find your writing.
So I have, so you can follow me on Twitter. It's Mohammed Gilan. So the spelling will be probably on the show notes. That's at Twitter. I have a public Facebook you can like over there, so I put some stuff up there. But my writings mainly appear on Imanwire, which is at almadinainstitute.org. The blog is Imanwire. And you can also find my writings at andalusonline.org. And finally, I have an online book club, and that's basically where I go through... I have a book list that's on Andalus Online. You guys can check it out. And what I'm doing with the book list is I'm taking these books. Some are written by Muslims, some are written by non-Muslims. But I'm looking at it through an Islamic perspective. So how would a Muslim, basically from an Islamic cosmology and theological perspective, look at these writings and explain them from a Muslim side? Like, how would we go through that? So those who are interested in how a Muslim reasons through the world, that's kind of the place to go find me. So I engage with the members there at the forum, and I also have a monthly webinar where I go through a book a month. And it's about an hour to an hour and a half long webinar, live webinar with the members there. So that's kind of where I'm at right now.
Well, that sounds pretty awesome, and I'm going to extend an official offer to you. If you ever want to do anything for mixedmentalarts.co,
awesome.
We would love to have that. I know that Waleed has said that he'd like to start doing, even just taking people through, a sort of non-Muslim audience through some of the hadith.
Mm-hmm.
And I know that there are some great stories, both in the Quran and then just sort of the companions of the Prophet,
mm-hmm.
the early parts of the Islamic world. And I think it would be, mixed mental arts is all about the fact that wisdom is everywhere in all times and places.
Mm.
And it has to be extracted out and it has to be brought together.
Yeah.
And I think part of what's going to sort of disrupt the narratives of people like Eric Zoolander
mm-hmm.
is when we start to show the Western world, in particular, all of the wisdom that does exist in Islamic culture.
Mm-hmm.
And when, we start to appreciate that more and more, then we're disrupting those simplistic narratives. And, also when we're talking about problems like corruption,
mm.
then suddenly those old narratives don't quite fit the evidence. And already I've had a bunch of people tweeting at me being like, Sam Harris, I think you should really talk to Hunter Mons because I've lost a lot of respect for you because of these problems you raise with your PhD, the problems that you're not responsive to this evidence on multi-level selection, this cultural evolution stuff, which makes a lot of sense. And then just the ways in which your narratives about the Islamic world, the pictures you paint with statistics, are not a very good reflection for much of what's going on there.
So what you're doing is the difference between the teacher and, let's say, I don't know, something other than a teacher. What is a teacher's role in this world? A good teacher, because I taught, a good teacher makes the student independent of that teacher.
Mm-hmm.
That's what a good teacher is, so that you can impart with them not just information, but knowledge and wisdom and a methodology and a process so that they can go into the world and be independent human beings to reason through it on their own. And maybe they can disagree with you, but that's totally fine. At least they're now independent agents, as opposed to, I'm just going to be a passive consumer of whatever Sam Harris says on his podcast. By the way, check out my podcast, guys. Muhammad Ghailan is the podcast, iTunes, Stitcher.
It's the big difference between education and indoctrination.
Yeah, that's the word. That's what I was looking for. Yeah.
Yeah, because indoctrination is about putting a doctrine in, and education, I just always think it's fascinating when you get into etymology.
Yeah.
Because as you're saying about terminology, when the people who had to sort of come up with these terms had to sort of really think about what are we saying here, what is this about, and then it just becomes a word at a certain point, and we've lost touch with why they came up with that word. All the words.
Educare, to bring out.
Exactly.
Yeah.
As opposed to put a doctrine in, and that's the real point: is to educate people and. It's not, this is why I constantly say you don't have to believe me. In fact, you shouldn't believe me. You should go read the evidence and understand it for yourself, because my own ability to understand all 130 million books, 60 million articles, 6,000 extant languages in the world is limited.
Yeah, very limited.
But I can point out the problems with some of the simplistic narratives that some of the people who are trying to indoctrinate people are for. And destabilizing, crucially, this is how you see that the scientific method was a formalization of what human brains already do. If you destabilize, if you provide enough evidence that doesn't fit with the narratives that are being provided, the pictures that are being painted with statistics, then you start to be like, oh, that story doesn't really make sense anymore. Maybe I need a new story. And that breaking of the old story, that's science.
Yeah.
And all that science has done is to formalize that process and to bring better tools, both mathematical tools and tools in terms of microscopes and telescopes, to bear to better gather evidence and to better sort through large masses of data.
Yeah.
So to that end,
I think people are asleep by now.
well, unfortunately, my neighbors aren't asleep. They're really liking their jam on, which I'm excited about.
That's good.
But no, I mean, I think there's a real hunger out there as well for an alternative to the sort of the stupid sound bites and to hear a conversation. And, I think it's going to be particularly, you're great, Mohammed, for many reasons.
Thank you so much.
This podcast. But crucially, I think the reason why, I'm very excited about, people like Spiros and, John Haidt and David Wilson and you are because you're the sort of individuals who problematize people's narratives. It's for a new atheist, you are a real contradiction. Like, it's hard to make sense of you.
Yeah, I'm a contradiction to myself. I look at myself in the mirror, I get confused sometimes. But that's okay. It's okay, guys. Like, it's totally fine.
I think that's the key thing, though. I mean, who really is going to say that they have themselves entirely figured out?
Yeah.
And I think you have to be really intellectually dishonest to say that you have yourself all figured out, because I know that I certainly don't.
Yeah.
And that's the game.
That's
to
the
keep
game.
unpacking that Russian nesting doll. And layer by layer, you start to figure yourself out. Well, ladies and gentlemen, I will get from Mohammed all of these things and put them in the show notes. And then I'm really excited to have Mohammed be sensei and imam in the next mental health show.
Cheers, man.
Well, Dr. Muhammad, thanks so much for coming on the show, and I hope we can meet up in person one day and get Emperor Callan to take us out for dinner.
Hopefully, man. Would look forward to it.
All right, perfect. Have a good night.
Cheers.
Bye.
Bye.